Imagine working all day lifting heavy weights, and when you finally get home, you're absolutely exhausted. The only joy you have in life is playing a virtual reality game. They say whoever manages to clear this game would gain limitless wealth. But when he finally beats it and receives over $1 million in his account, he sleeps happily. However, upon waking up, he discovers the world has been invaded by monsters. The game has become reality, and he's the only one who knows every single detail, allowing him to outsmart the system. The story begins on a beautiful morning with clear skies. Someone was wearing VR goggles, breathing heavily and sweating profusely. Inside the game, he received congratulations for passing the final trial. Being the only one to finish the game, he happily asks if it's really all over. While a pixelated screen appears, someone mentions a scam game, reporting that's what they called this VR title. Prophecy Online was truly an impressive virtual reality experience. Immersive and action-packed, compatible with resolutions up to 16K. It was an open-world online RPG, where players could feel, smell, and hear things. That was Prophecy Online. The game promised that everyone who cleared it would obtain unlimited assets that couldn't be spent even in 10,000 years. Back then, no one believed in such a reward. He admits he was one of those people, just having fun with the game while asking for money and things like that. Indu says that ended that day, remembering when someone asked his team to take a break. He was at his workplace, as usual, asking if they would clear the debris in the afternoon. After failing to find a steady job, he started working part-time as a construction laborer, trapped in a routine of hard labor under the sun and being scolded by his older colleagues. Suddenly, Indu receives a message on his phone from the Prophecy Online administration. Seeing it's a message from the game, he wonders if he forgot to turn off mail notifications. The message congratulates him for reaching first place in the beta test, stating the rewards would be deposited into his account. Smiling, Indu asks if they're really still sending those scam emails. But as he says he'll check the account, he looks at his phone and comments that it would be impossible for them to have actually deposited anything in his bank. Surprisingly, 1 million yen had been deposited. A man approaches him, saying he'll need his help when the break ends. The man, worried, approaches and touches his shoulder, asking if he feels unwell. Indu simply starts running, laughing out loud, leaving his partner on the ground wondering where he's running off to, full of hope. The player wonders if this is true and if he could really make money from the game, questioning if the reward that couldn't be spent in 10,000 years was real, which makes him throw himself completely into the game. That game was relentless and ruthless, using its players as sacrifices. The Guardian of the Tower destroyed defeated users along with their data. In the tower's dungeon, the exit was always randomized, and the best part of all this exploration, they felt the same pain as the characters when taking damage, always facing the real fear of death, causing many players to abandon the game. Indu earned enough money to cover his expenses through a part-time job. However, to play more, he went into debt, taking out loans from loan sharks and banks. Now he had no choice but to wait for the promised unlimited assets that couldn't be spent in 10,000 years. Returning to the moment, he finally finished the game. They only congratulate him, telling him the true assets are his experiences. With that, exhausted, he begins to take off the VR headset in complete disbelief. He wonders if he really did all that for nothing. Leaving everything, he runs toward his phone, anxious for the reward. He clicks on the email sent by the Prophecy Online team. They announce they recently reached their goal, and for this reason, Prophecy Online would be shut down. Nervous, Indu wonders what will happen to his rewards while reading the game's thanks for everyone's patronage. Feeling sick, he ends up dropping his phone on the floor. Lamenting while his phone remains broken on the ground, kneeling, Indu wonders if, after finishing the game, they will reward him properly. The day remains sunny and the neighborhood quiet, as if his problems affected no one. As he walks toward his bed, he tries to convince himself that since it's a large sum of money, maybe the transfer is just delayed. Indu lies down exhausted on his bed, saying he'll check it the next day. The next day, looking at his phone, he confesses he hasn't received anything more since the 1 million yen and that he should have quit. After these events, a week passes. He hears a loud noise and wonders what is happening so early. Looking at his phone, Indu notices the sound isn't coming from it. That's when he looks up and sees the system window. In front of him were notifications stating that the trial of ice had failed and Moscow had been destroyed. Next would be the trial of Earth, with a time limit of 43 days. In case of failure, the trial location would be annihilated, now being Japan. He looks at it all confused, not understanding what is happening on the TV. Terrified journalists inform the population about the current state of Moscow while monsters completely devastated the city. The Russian government declares there is no hope for survivors. Not knowing what kind of creatures those are, the journalists announce they look like dragons. The helicopter observed the monsters from above. The journalist inside reports that a similar situation is about to occur in Japan, according to gathered information. The woman comments that many say it's a disaster originating from a game called Prophecy Online. Being completely similar, a geologist claims the only possible cause of a disaster on such a scale would be the movement of continental plates, not monsters. While a monster opens its mouth toward the helicopter, the journalist asks if it's trying to aim at them. Someone screams desperately, asking them to get out of there and return. But unfortunately, there is no response. The terrified presenter starts screaming the journalist's name, asking if she can hear him. The specialist, horrified by the scene, says that could never happen with plate movement. Running to his balcony, the protagonist says there is no doubt about this. He confesses that even in this crazy situation, he managed to stay calm, with this extreme calm. Only one thing came to his mind. Elsewhere, a woman was trying to learn how the system works. Pressing the main event button, Indu also presses that button, noticing the time limit was 43 days and the trial location was Japan with zero progress. He remembers the game message saying his experience would be something invaluable. The protagonist assumes the invaluable assets mentioned by the game would be his experiences. After all, he was the only one who managed to finish it. Suddenly, after a long time, his door opens. Looking sharp, the boy walks out. Convinced, with a swindler smile, he says that now he will get his money. While running, he says that with the game becoming reality, there will be great competition for spots and experience points. Still moving very fast, he calculates that the nearest dungeon is right in front of him. Indu hurries toward a large building. Many people are running and despairing, wondering how they can escape, since buses and trains are out of service. Anxious and in a hurry, he continues running. Unexpectedly, someone angrily yells at him to stop. The man stands in front of him, leaving the protagonist surprised. He asks Indu if he's going to ignore his reminders and just walk away. Looking at the man, he reports that it's one of the loan sharks looking for him. The loan shark says he was on his way to his house and orders him to turn around immediately. He flicks a cigarette in his face. 1 year ago, while the protagonist was in a dungeon, an advertisement suddenly popped up. It was from a company offering 200,000 yen interest-free to anyone who passed their selection process. But in exchange, they demanded 50% of all future rewards. Indu commented that it seemed like a good deal, thinking he'd take the interest-free cash and only pay after clearing the game. However, after he spent the 200,000 yen, they informed him he failed the selection, meaning he had to pay 50% interest within 10 days. Recalling a time when he had a gun pointed at him just like that, Indu started taking out bank loans just to pay off those debts. But when he tried to settle them, they brushed him aside, waiting for the interest to pile up even higher. The man asks with a smirk if the protagonist finally has the money to pay back the loan. Annoyed, Indu glares at the loan shark and asks how he's supposed to pay if they refuse to see him. The man scoffs, saying people always find excuses when they don't want to pay, calling him despicable. Still smiling, the loan shark mentions that, luckily, he's there for other business today. He asks Indu if he wasn't playing that Prophecy Online game. The man notes that the current state of the world is identical to that of the game. Grabbing Indu by his clothes, he demands to know if he has any intel, ordering him to spill everything he knows. The protagonist coldly orders the man to take his filthy hands off him. Even more enraged, the man asks Indu who he thinks he's talking to. Then, the protagonist tells the loan shark, Taco, that he'll give him some useful information instead. He activates his skill, Novice's Fist, forcing the loan shark back, Taco. He increases his fist power by 50% and begins pummeling the man. The force of his attacks was so immense that the loan shark was sent flying straight into a traffic sign. Looking down at the man collapsed on the ground, he declares that he's the boss now while observing the unconscious, bleeding Taco. Indu comments that it seems the loan shark isn't in any condition to hear him anymore. He simply leaves Taco there and resumes running toward his objective. Watching from inside a car, a man in a black hood remarks that those must be the in-game skills. With his face partially covered, he says with a smile that he didn't expect to find an experienced player so soon. The man comments that law and order will soon collapse, making things much more interesting. The protagonist arrives at a location called the Goat's Sanctuary, but unexpectedly, something catches his attention when he spots a car already there. He wonders if someone arrived before him. Indu begins his descent into the deep, dark dungeon, continuing through the corridors. While searching for something, he suddenly detects a heavy scent of blood. To his surprise, in front of him lie dozens of dead lizard men. The same hooded man, along with his group, notices that someone else has apparently arrived, looking toward Indu. The man asks the protagonist if he was also a player of Prophecy Online. Somewhat irritated, Indu asks if this group was the one responsible for the slaughter. The hooded man claims those were high-level monsters, and if it weren't for him, the protagonist would already be dead. Indu starts questioning if the lizard men are truly high-level. He remembers their level was the lowest of the low. Removing his hood, the man remarks that Indu apparently has no friends, asking if he'd like to become one of his subordinates. He tells the protagonist he'll have to hand over half of everything he earns, but in exchange, he'll protect him since he's very strong. Everyone standing behind him acts enchanted by his supposed kindness. Indu apologizes, stating he prefers to go solo. Pointing forward, he asks if they really think they can get past the boss. They're left stunned at the mere thought of it. Talking to his group, the hooded man asks if it's worth killing Indu after they finish off the boss, leaving everyone feeling nervous. The man says the fewer people who have game intel, the better. He says that's his decision, and anyone who disagrees will face an accidental death. Suddenly, everyone feels a wave of fear and nervousness. The man informs his subordinates that the boss of this place is the Ember's goat, and he doesn't want the protagonist to get the final blow. Only 5 minutes remained until the door would open. Some of them approach Indu, who looks surprised. A girl along with 2 other men walk toward him, looking a bit nervous but smiling. He asks if they're going to try and stop him, looking a bit tense. They start telling him he's right and that he should stay right there. He assumes, mentally, that he could just toss them outside, but decides to let them go this time. The door opens, while the protagonist thinks it still won't be too late, and he'll defeat the boss after most of them have died. After the time for the door to open finally runs out, it swings wide. Indu simply pulls a juice from his inventory and leans against the wall, biding his time. Hearing the gates slam shut, he looks toward the boss room, wondering how far they'll actually get. As they enter, the leader comments that it was convenient Indu didn't go with them. The girl mentions that maybe the protagonist realized their intent to kill him, but the leader replies he isn't smart enough to notice that. In front of them is a massive, completely empty warehouse, with only a single light beam entering through a crack in the ceiling. Striking the shield of one of his subordinates, the leader orders him to do his job. The guy says that with his shield, the boss won't be a problem, calling the leader Sir Light. A candle emitted violet flames from a chandelier on the wall. Suddenly, a powerful wind hits them, leaving everyone bewildered. Surprisingly, a massive fire tornado forms right in front of them. The leader, terrified, begins to question what kind of scenario this is. Interrupting his thoughts, an enormous hoof emerges from the flames. It's then that he realizes this is the Hellfire Goat. The monster was a fusion of a goat, wolf, horse, and other animals. The goat emits a deafening roar, sending a shockwave of fire spreading everywhere. Many warriors scream as another devastating attack hits them. Light himself, along with some of his subordinates, is thrown against the entrance door. He curses, wondering how everything ended up like this with a monster standing right before him. A terrified girl asks what they should do now. Enraged, he orders her to shut up and tells everyone to fall back. One of his subordinates screams that the door is locked. The leader replies that's impossible and wonders what's going on. He starts shouting, ordering some of them to distract the creature, saying the shield should be able to stop the monster's attacks. The man carrying the shield tries to say something, but his leader ignores him and orders him to do as he's told. The shielder positions himself in front of the creature as it raises its mace. The man, completely overwhelmed by fear, holds the shield in front of him, but without standing a single chance, he is crushed by the creature. His companions are deathly afraid and begin to run. After the boss raises its mace again, the lifeless man can be seen on the floor. The strange creature picks up the man's shield with its fingers. Unexpectedly, it puts it in its mouth. It begins to chew it as if it were nothing. They start saying it's unbelievable. After all, it was an epic level shield. Light concludes that everything is completely wrong. After all, the monster they came to face was supposed to be a low-level one that anyone could defeat. He says this happened after an update. Before, it was a monster called the Hellfire Goat, and no player could overcome such a monster. Trembling with fear, he reaches the conclusion that this world is based on the initial version of the game. Light remembers that the protagonist is waiting outside, and that maybe he can open the door. The leader begins pounding on the door desperately, begging Indu to open it, promising they'll share the reward. However, as expected, he receives no response. Annoyed, Light asks if the man can hear him and orders him to open the door immediately. But something flashes rapidly close to his body. When Light looks back, he realizes the monster is charging at him, tearing through all his subordinates until it strikes him too. Once again, everyone is sent flying. Left completely wounded and staring at the monster, Light comments that with such ridiculous physical strength, they'll all be annihilated soon. Opening the door, Indu asks if after all that bragging, that was all Light could manage, telling him he has no talent for being a leader. With a proud smirk, our scammer observes the monster. Even though he's nearly dying, the man still insults him mentally. He confesses to himself that he'll use the protagonist to escape and starts calling his subordinates, ordering them to retreat. Indu trips the girl while telling her that fleeing isn't a good idea. With the girl on the ground, she realizes the door is closing. The protagonist watches the so-called leader, Light. He runs toward the door, mentally begging to at least make it through, when suddenly, he begins to scream intensely as the door crushes his arm. The monster heads toward the leader, calling him a noisy brat as it prepares to attack. It tells him the boy is very irritating and that it will finish him right there. Light looks back, seeing the monster closing in on him. Suddenly, a massive amount of blood spatters across the room. Watching that terrifying scene, the girl and the man who try to stop the protagonist wonder what they can possibly do against such a monster. While picking up a sword from the ground, Indu says the action they must take is quite obvious. Lifting the sword, he comments that even if Light was weak, at least he had a good blade, and that was enough for someone like him. The monster, once again preparing its mace, asks if the protagonist has such a death wish. It deals a heavy blow, sending stone fragments flying in every direction. The protagonist appears above the monster, preparing to counterattack with a smile. He asks the monster what it's talking about. In the blink of an eye, he manages to slash the monster into several pieces. The monster screams as its horns fall to the ground. Light's former subordinates look at the man, terrified by his level of strength. Indu calmly asks them what they think. Once more, our scammer tells them that if they pay him 10 million yen, he'll consider saving them. The terrified girl looks at him, not knowing if he's being serious. Both the girl and her companion scream, asking if he's really demanding 10 million. He says that's exactly right, and he'll only charge 1 million per person. Irritated, they start saying it's impossible for anyone to have that amount on hand, and that he's just trying to exploit the situation. Indu responds that if they don't have money, they'll have to pay with their bodies, asking if they want to die so young. Then, the hero tells them they will work for him, handing over 90% of everything they earn. The girl yells, telling him to stop treating them like idiots, while her friend says even Light only charged 50%. As the monster rises behind them, Indu comments that it seems there's nothing else to be done. The monster stands up, even more furious, and asks who dare to cut off its precious horns. It launches a massive fireball, screaming that they should die 1,000 deaths. The girl invokes magic, trying to protect herself. The protagonist leaps into the middle of the flames. Both are blown back by the force of the impact. Indu lands softly in front of them with a smile. He says they apparently managed to escape, but asks how much longer that luck will last. With that, both surrender and say they'll work for him, but implore him to save them. He begins to smile, satisfied with the result, commenting that it seems they've closed the deal while looking at the monster, saying it's been a long time since he last defeated it. The angry monster says it doesn't remember being defeated by someone like him. Both subordinates begin to wonder what he's talking about, since the Hellfire Goat should have been eliminated before anyone could defeat it. Without answering them, a determined Indu just watches the monster. He remembers that before the update, he had defeated the monster once. He confesses that he heard from some sources that the Hellfire Goat was transformed into the Ember's Goat. With just one move of his sword, the protagonist manages to deflect the monster's attack. The monster watches him, confused, not understanding how he was capable. Both subordinates look at him, wondering who Indu really is, as he managed to stop the monster with great ease. The protagonist confesses to the monster that if its attack had reached him, he would surely be dead. However, attacks aren't dangerous when one knows the tricks. The monster keeps striking at him while he dodges and blocks everything with certain ease. The monster grows increasingly angry, wondering how this is possible, while the protagonist jumps behind it, brandishing his sword. Indu manages to strike the monster's eye, telling it that its patterns are exactly like in the game. As he moves away from the battle, his new subordinates notice he's pushing the monster back. They start cheering him on, encouraged by his victory. Irritated, Indu tells them they're too noisy, and one of his subordinates calls him frustrating. Suddenly, a powerful attack passes right by Indu, leaving him surprised. Slamming its great mace into the ground, the monster comments that the protagonist's dodging ability is admirable, but it all ends here. Leaning his back against the wall, the player realizes he's cornered. He asks the Hellfire Goat if that was its plan, from the beginning, to corner him, without answering his question. The monster asks him if he has any last words. With a smile, the protagonist simply orders the monster to drop dead, as it can't even land its attacks on him. Even more enraged, the monster says it will grant his wish as it summons flames around itself. It opens its mouth, concentrating a massive core of fire in the center. The subordinates begin to wonder what those black flames are. Indu explains that it's the flame that burns everything, capable of killing even a level 99 player instantly. It's an attack that scorches the entire floor, leaving no escape route. This is the goat's ultimate strike, its last hope. While smiling with his eyes glowing purple, he says that's nothing. Indu mentions he was waiting for this moment as he activates his novice's kick skill on the ground, adding just 50% more strength. He causes a great flash to cover the spot where he stood. Skillfully, he leaps toward the monster, saying that although it's a powerful attack, it leaves the user completely defenseless, and furthermore, its mouth doesn't have the same strength compared to the rest of its body. Positioning himself on the ceiling to gain momentum, he says that, in other words, that level 1 strength is enough to keep it shut, stabbing the monster's mouth from top to bottom. The monster collapses to the floor, desperately trying to open its mouth while the flames burn it from the inside. Indu, exhausted from the battle, informs that once the skill is activated, it can no longer be stopped. With that, there's nothing more the monster can do except feel the flames burning its entire body. He leaps back, taking his distance, while asking if the monster can handle its own flames. From a bit further away, the monster can be seen being carbonized by its own attack. Watching the monster, Indu says goodbye. When the Hellfire Goat finally opens its mouth, it only manages to let out a scream. After a while, the monster was completely carbonized. The system notifies that the unique boss, the Hellfire Goat, has been defeated, while the girl and the boy cannot believe they are still alive. Observing the protagonist, they notice he killed the boss without even a scratch. The system congratulates him, announcing that Indu was the first to defeat a unique boss. He is then granted the title First Slayer, which leaves him a bit confused, as he doesn't recall anything like this in the game. This title grants him a 50% damage boost when facing a boss. Additionally, as an extra reward, he can choose a subclass. The system asks if he will select a subclass now, and he answers yes. The system also explains that once a subclass is decided, it cannot be changed. With determination, he chooses the occupation of Soulsmith. Indu extends his arm, resolute in his choice. Suddenly, a brilliant light surrounds his body, and with a smile, he says it looks like he's going to make a lot of money. Collecting the boss drops, he notices a dagger and a key. The girl informs him that it's the underground sewer key. It's an excellent spot to level up quickly and earn cash. The man accompanying her says their original goal was the super rare drop from a boss. Indu starts spinning the key on his finger and explains that the item isn't that rare since the drop rate is 100% with the Hellfire Goat. They are horrified by how casually he treats an item that is normally so difficult to obtain. Observing the dagger, he assumes that item was acquired through pure luck. Indu walks toward the debris while aiming the blade. Yellow and blue sparks begin to fly from it. With a simple downward flick of his hand, he slices through the rubble. Both Subordinates watch in awe, wondering what kind of power that dagger holds. While saying it's not quite good enough yet, he begins using his subclass skill, hoping materials will be easy to find. Even though the term subclass sounds like something secondary, Indu informs them that it is actually the most vital part. He explains that the soulsmith occupation allows him to use small soul fragments to create or strengthen items. This is the only occupation that allows him to reach the endgame. The protagonist activates his skill, Soul Eyes. Looking at the sword, he discovers it can be awakened with a fragment of an F-rank mage's soul. Upon observing the girl, he realizes she is a mage, and there will be no consequences to extracting the fragment if they sign a contract. He confesses he would have liked to know that before agreeing to take 90% of their rewards. Driving his dagger into the ground, he says he still has something else he can use. Looking at them both, he asks if they wanted that key to level up. Confused, they ask if it's okay. Indu says that in exchange, they'll have to give him all the items on a specific list, which will slightly reduce the debt they have to pay. Both feel extremely happy and begin to thank him. The protagonist says they don't need to thank him since, after all, the more they earn, the more he profits, thus fulfilling the extraction conditions. He has successfully acquired an F-rank mage soul fragment. With the materials in hand, Indu once again activates his soul smith skill. He orders the sword to awaken as it begins to glow radiantly. While fragments swirl in a tornado of power, the sword gains a purple-tinted edge. Holding the dagger before him, he realizes he has gained a new skill called Soul Slash. The hero activates the skill to test it out while his subordinates stand there terrified. He launches an attack forward, slicing through everything in its path. The attack was so powerful it tore right through the warehouse, revealing a forest outside. Both subordinates stare at the crater he opened, impressed by such overwhelming force. Everyone stares at the power released by a simple movement of the dagger before collapsing to the ground, wondering if a human could truly possess such power. Looking at the dagger, he says this seems to be his current limit. Looking at the girl, Indu comments that he now has a weapon and a minimum set of skills, but he should take the next step. The protagonist stops right in front of the girl, making her freeze in fear. Rumi covers her face, thinking he's going to kill her. To her surprise, Indu simply continues walking. While she remains confused about what is happening, he kneels before the bodies of his subordinates' former comrades and begins to pray. Rumi watches him, enchanted, wondering if Indu is mourning the fallen players. However, in reality, the protagonist only wanted the wallets of those extras. The little thief starts smiling, saying they had plenty of cash. Both conclude that he is even more dangerous than the Hellfire Goat. Somewhere else, various black feathers fall from the sky. Around a sanctuary, several crows fly as someone stands before the door. It was Indu, who was observing the location. He calmly approaches a well and heads down the stairs. The protagonist informs that beneath this well lies a vast number of monsters. Normally, they would only be challenged by a group of 3 or more, but Indu says that doesn't apply to him. Since he has the goat's dagger, after finishing the descent, he looks around. Suddenly, he hears the sound of a coin flying toward him. He quickly slices it in half, avoiding contact. Taking a battle stance, the player puts his dagger forward, losing his patience. He glares ahead. Unexpectedly, 3 men appear, asking if there is a new visitor. The man with a bloodthirsty look tells the protagonist that this place belongs to them. Pointing his sword at the men, he asks who decided that. The man responds at first come, first served, asking if that isn't the rule of the game. One of the men says they'd let him use the spot if he pays a fee. Realizing these men are just like him, Indu asks for the price. The man tells him he'll charge 50,000 yen per hour, since the protagonist would be earning more anyway. He hands the money to the men, who thank him and inform him that Indu has 1 hour starting now. Venturing deeper into the dungeons, he enters the Lover Wolf's cave. Suddenly, the player hears a howl. A white wolf charges rapidly in his direction. When he realizes it, he is surrounded by dozens of wolves. He says those are lover wolves, mid-level monsters, which are easy to make money from, and this cave is the only place where they appear in packs. He says he could use the soul sword, but it's better to save it for now. In the blink of an eye, all the wolves lunge at him. Skillfully, he dives toward them. In a flash, he passes through, slicing all the wolves. He keeps killing them, walking through the middle of the pack and decapitating them. After finishing them all off, he simply ceases his attack. He sits among the corpses to catch his breath. Smiling, he says that as expected, they didn't leave much behind. Unexpectedly, one of the men who confronted him at the entrance appears behind him, preparing to strike. The protagonist manages to defend against his enemy's attack with ease. Wielding his dagger, he counterattacks. Surprisingly, the man manages to dodge. However, the attack hits the ceiling of the cave, causing a massive explosion. His enemy, with a wound on his forehead, assumes that was very dangerous. The protagonist notes that the man was able to dodge his attack, albeit with difficulty, showing his combat experience. The player tells the big guy that he apparently likes to play dirty. After all, he waited for him to kill the monsters and lower his guard. With a maniacal grin, his adversary says he absolutely loves doing this. The protagonist concludes their true goal is to wait for other players to collect gear, then kill them and loot everything. Overhearing their conversation, the group leader remarks that he's apparently figured it out. Smiling, the protagonist notes that this is a secret spot used by all sorts of cheaters, so it would be weird if they were the only ones here. Indu says if they wanted to trick him, they should have at least planned a fake round first. The player assumes to himself that he actually only realized this after seeing their weapons. He notices the big guy is using a type of brass knuckles, the famous rocket knuckles. It's a risky move, but it boosts the user's speed significantly. He also comments on the thin guy's weapon, a sword that cuts through high-frequency vibrations. As for the ring the leader wears, that is truly a problematic item. The leader apologizes for the misunderstanding, and says he'll even give him compensation for the trouble. Reaching into his coat, he throws hundreds of coins toward the protagonist. Indu is surprised as the coins fall around him, but he also gets incredibly angry inside, noting the guy is tossing 10,000 yen around like it's nothing. As the man's ring glows, he claims his hand slipped and asks the protagonist to pick them up for him, realizing the trap. The protagonist asks if making his enemy kneel is really his idea of compensation. He explains that the ring's skill creates small explosions with the coins and wonders if his enemies are underestimating him. Tossing his dagger into the air, the protagonist says they can't expect to go home alive after hunting a higher-ranked player. As the three cluster in front of him, they ask if Indu has forgotten that it's 3 against 1. While readying his dagger, the protagonist says that even if they all team up, they wouldn't be worth a single yen. The leader, even more enraged, insults him while glaring furiously. The man snaps his fingers, activating the explosion skill. With that, a massive explosion occurs. The leader orders his subordinates to cut him limb from limb until he's dead. The big guy appears behind him, positioning himself to launch an attack. With some difficulty, the protagonist manages to dodge the strike. Something catches his eye while he's still in midair. It was the thin guy, who claimed he wasn't very good at holding back. The protagonist manages to parry his enemy's sword while the companion launches a series of blows at his back. However, to everyone's surprise, the player makes a single move, blowing them both away. Looking at the leader, the protagonist says it seems the no-disturb agreement for 50,000 yen was broken, so he'll be charging interest. He launches several attacks toward the leader, smiling as he says he'll pay them back with interest, using explosive coins from above. We can see the protagonist in the center, raising his dagger with 2 enemies on the ground and the leader still standing. The long-haired man activates his explosive coin skill once again. Indu dashes while weaving through the coins. Without wasting a second, the thin guy attacks him from above. With relative ease, he blocks the attack of the furious thin guy. However, his fury turns to pure terror upon seeing his sword shattered. Without giving him a chance to process what's happening, the protagonist attacks him again. The leader, seeing this scene, wonders if the protagonist's dagger is actually a rare tier item. While Indu fights all 3, the leader assumes this is still within expectations, and that, either way, they won't be defeated by someone like him so quickly. The player tries to avoid the explosions once more. Indu gets annoyed seeing them throw money away like it's worthless. The big guy appears behind him again, trying to land a hit. The protagonist manages to dodge the attack, while a massive explosion is triggered by the blow. The force of the blast was so great that even his companions had to shield themselves. The player's blade spins in the air, as if announcing their defeat. The big guy starts to celebrate, saying it was a great challenge, while his friend tells him he needs to learn how to restrain himself. The thin guy, sword in hand, acknowledges that the visitor was truly strong. The long-haired man reaches down to pick up the dagger, saying it doesn't matter how good the weapon is if the user is dead. Suddenly, Indu activates his skill, soul restraint, shackling the thin guy and the big guy, leaving only the leader, who is now terrified. Both warriors begin to scream in pain as the chains tighten. The worried leader starts screaming their names as someone emerges from a mist. The player explains he used his soul smith skill to inflict unrivaled pain. The enraged leader charges at the protagonist, wielding the goat's dagger. Before he could even get into position, the protagonist stops him, staring him down. Indu tells him he's slow, extremely angry. The man says there's no way he's going to lose. He leaps backward while unbuttoning his coat, sending dozens of coins flying. Confident, the leader tells him to marvel at this. However, now even more irritated, the protagonist reactivates his soul restraint skill. In the blink of an eye, his adversary is completely bound in chains. He tries to scream as chains tighten around his neck. The long-haired man doesn't understand why his skill won't activate. Indu explains that with a massive level gap, he can nullify the enemy's power, even while chained. The man asks what gap he's talking about, since he's already at level 7. Tightening the grip, the player tells him he did a good job for a beginner. Looking at the three, Indu tries to figure out the conditions to obtain their soul fragments. For the big guy, it was to satisfy his hunger. For the thin guy, it was to introduce him to his older sister. For the leader, it was to make him genuinely fear the protagonist. With a wicked look, he says the leader has a condition he can fulfill right now. Strangling the leader, who begins to beg for his life while grabbing his dagger, the player says he'd be the only one at a loss if he left him alive. The terrified man starts asking what he's talking about. Indu says he'll sell off parts of his body. After all, there are always buyers. Once again, our thief notes the interest rate on those 50,000 yen was very high. The thin guy starts screaming, saying the protagonist looks like someone who would actually do something like that. He feels offended, saying it makes no sense for someone who lives off odd jobs like him to have black market connections. Indu tells them if they don't like that idea, they should find another way to make money. In complete terror, the leader implores for his life as tears stream down his face. The system notifies that Koki fears him deeply and the conditions have been met, acquiring a mage soul fragment. After this, the protagonist simply releases him from the chains. They collapse to the floor, gasping for breath. The protagonist hands them several contracts, demanding they sign. They feel indignant at the fact they'll have to give up 90% of their earnings and obey every single order. With bloodlust, Indu glares at them, asking if they have any complaints. Terrified, both respond that they have none. He tells them that the three are now his subordinates, and if they ever think of betraying him, the surgery table will be their destiny. Unexpectedly, Indu asks them to lead him to the true leader. They are all extremely terrified, asking how he found out. He responds that the items they're using wouldn't be acquired by weaklings like them. Obviously, someone is behind this. He asks if he's right. Koki starts begging, saying if the boss finds out, he'll kill them. Placing his foot on his subordinate's head, Indu asks if he's going to betray his old boss or if he'd prefer an organ transplant. Trembling, the thin guy starts to mutter something suddenly. He starts crying and runs away, saying he doesn't want either option, leaving the big guy stunned. The player points his finger at the man, asking if he really thinks he can escape like that. His soul restraint chains ensnare the man once again. His two companions are deathly afraid of the fact that Indu possesses such total control. While their partner is being choked, they promise to lead him to their boss. However, Indu still demands all their weapons and money. The protagonist notes that security in this world is abysmal. Even the game's security was better. With a smirk, Indu laughs, saying there's likely no one who can actually hurt him at his current level. In his status window, we can see that the protagonist is on a completely different playing field. Night falls. We see a circus. Like any circus, there is a central stage, where the tightrope walker performs, along with rings of fire and other spectacles. Then, we are shown someone being brutally beaten by a man. The victim collapses to the ground, bleeding. Some people trapped in a sort of cage say he'll be next, and that they're so sorry. A man with a blood-stained face yells at the victim, saying he hasn't even completed his task. The man asks him if he's not even going to apologize to the boss. Another man in the cage screams for him to stop, saying if he doesn't, the person will die. With a sadistic smile, says the guy should just die and that they're all causing way too much trouble for the boss. Someone wielding a whip asks why they are talking about him. The sadistic man begins to stutter, calling him boss. The boss, wearing clown makeup, asks his subordinate if he's finished disciplining him. Helping the man on the ground up, the boss says if he had broken a bone, it would take too long to recover. He tells his subordinate that no matter how incompetent they are, he shouldn't just break them. Trembling and sweating, the sadist starts apologizing to the boss with tears in his eyes. The victim thanks the boss, saying next time he'll definitely get it right. However, his gratitude is cut short when the clown suddenly draws his whip. The man is struck in the face with an extremely powerful blow. He continues, lashing the man, saying this is the best way since it doesn't break bones but destroys the flesh. Still assaulting him, the boss says not even animal welfare organizations would help him for being so lazy. Suddenly, catching the boss's attention, someone announces they have returned. With a macabre look, the boss says they came back far too soon. The long-haired man says they need to report since they're in no state to continue the operation. The clown notices his hand and realizes the ring is gone. He becomes enormously irritated. While glaring at Koki, the boss asks where the ring he lent him is, saying it's worth more than his own life. The long-haired man bows, apologizing and saying they were robbed by a man who was practically a monster. Ignoring the explanation, the boss simply strikes him. Koki hits the ground from the force of the impact. Enraged, the boss says that although his guild doesn't have many people, it's impossible that he's surrounded only by incompetent scum. Both of Koki's companions confess that most members quit due to his power harassment. The boss says there's only one job left for Koki as he calls for his other subordinate, Locke. The clown asks him to bring out Johnny. Suddenly, there appears a massive white tiger paw. The beast stalks toward the long-haired man. The animal roars, staring at him furiously. Stuttering in fear, the man begs the boss not to do this, claiming he's been faithful to his orders since the beginning. With a smile, the clown gives the order, Johnny, eat your dinner. The great tiger opens its maw toward Koki, who remains paralyzed by fear. Suddenly, someone appears, swinging from the circus equipment. It's the protagonist. He saves his new subordinate by kicking the tiger away with his absurd strength. He manages to send the beast flying. Worried about his animal, the boss glares at him while screaming its name. The player, with a smirk, apologizes but says he couldn't let him kill his source of income. The boss runs to his animal, asking if it's okay and saying it must have been so scared. Desperate, Koki asks why Ndu took so long to show up, but the scammer only complains that there wasn't much worth stealing. Unsurprisingly, the boss attacks him from behind with his whip. However, unexpectedly for him, the protagonist slices the whip while his back is still turned. In the blink of an eye, the boss was left without a whip as it fell to the floor in several pieces. Now with a hint of fear and nervousness, the clown asks who he is. Ndu claims to be the new boss of those men, while his sword glows purple. An annoyed Locke asks where his gratitude toward the boss is. The men ask why they should be grateful, since they only obeyed out of fear, but now the protagonist is scarier than him. The protagonist, staring him down, asks if he heard him. Ndu, pointing to the other caged men, tells them if they sign a contract, he will protect them from that weakling. The man who had just been assaulted asks if he will really take him out of that hell. With a malicious smile, the protagonist promises he will. The player tells them all he will only charge 50% of everything they earn. This upsets his other subordinates since he charged them 90%. Irritated, he says it's because they try to kill him. Trembling with rage, the clown asks if, besides hurting his animal, he also wants to steal his subordinates. His eyes glow purple as he vows to kill all four of them. Ndu notes they are in Japan and asks since when such barbaric behavior has been tolerated. Pulling an ID from his inventory, the clown says as long as he has this. It was a guildmaster ID and a director's card from the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications. The protagonist is surprised to learn he's a guildmaster. He says that the Japanese government grants guild masters the power to act above the law and conquer dungeons. Andre says not even the police can lay a finger on him. Currently in Japan, those with power face no consequences. With a smirk, Ndu asks if that means becoming a guild master allows one to conduct dark business without consequences. The clown calls the protagonist a fool while drawing a weapon, explaining that to be a guild master one must be rank B. He aims his gun at the protagonist. The guild master says he's going to die, so he doesn't need to know anything else. The man begins firing, saying he'll turn him into a sieve. Indu just watches the bullets flying toward him. The protagonist uses his skill, Soul Barrier. It is a barrier unlocked at level 25 using E-rank magic soul fragments. While he keeps firing, the clown insults and praises him at the same time, calling Indu cunning. The protagonist notes that Russia used nuclear missiles during the trial of ice and still achieved nothing. He asks the guild master if he's ever stopped to think about that. After all, there are many players but none use firearms. Still shooting, the boss begs him not to come closer. Suddenly, he receives a massive electric shock, causing him to drop the gun. The encroaching barrier finally reaches him. Starting to push him, he desperately strains against the barrier, trying to stop it. As he continues advancing toward the man, the protagonist tells him to look closely. While trying to hold back the barrier, he realizes he's being crushed. He is completely pressed against the wall, causing several cracks. The man begins coughing up blood, while Indu laughs. The former guild master collapses to the ground, strengthless, after the protagonist dispels the barrier. Looking at the man, he says skills surpass weapons, and that Andre shouldn't think he can win with those toys. The former subordinates begin saying that even the boss couldn't do anything against this man. With a smile, the protagonist asks if they want to do business with him or not, and if they accept, he'll even let them have their revenge. They all sign the contract. As long as they can do whatever they want with the scoundrel. Slumped on the ground, the master asks how someone without a license could do this, claiming the authorities won't stay quiet. Indu says he doesn't care. After all, the man himself told him that power is everything now. With his head still bowed, the clown realizes a pair of feet are approaching. When he looks up, he realizes they are all his former subordinates. While the ex-subordinates pummel their old boss, the player assumes he really made a killing today and that they will bring him even more profit. Glancing at the system window, he says it would be best to clear the trial right when people start falling into despair. He realizes there's only 1 month left, concluding that is the perfect timing. At the headquarters of the Player Association, the rank certification exam is taking place. The protagonist goes to take the exam. He notices 3 people chatting behind him. One of them says if you're a rank B player or higher, you'll get a massive salary, something in the tens of millions of yen. His friend tells him not to get his hopes up, since only 1% of the Japanese population is rank B, and only 9 people are rank A. They continue arguing while the protagonist just listens in. Indu notes that 2 weeks have passed since the game became reality. The government offered a reward of 100 million to whoever manages to clear the trial, but as expected, the result was disastrous. That's why it's now mandatory to apply to the Player Association. If you don't participate and take the tests, you won't receive any rewards for it. Walking toward the association, the protagonist assumes there's a lot of money involved and he wants a piece of it, but someone is watching him from above. He realizes he's being observed and tries to spot the person. Suddenly, an object flies in his direction. With great ease, he deflects the attack. The people around him are shocked, saying a traffic light just fell from the sky. It was Taco calling out to him and saying he just got lucky before. He screams, saying the protagonist won't get away from his debt that easily. The protagonist asks if the loan shark came to take the exam too. He responds that someone so weak they were defeated by a single hit of the novice's fist, skill should give up on being a player. Overconfident, Taco says he's not the same anymore and now has the strongest class. Launcher. The protagonist starts laughing, saying that class is only for amateurs who don't know what they're doing. The protagonist says that class can't keep up with the power inflation, and the loan shark asks what his class is. With a wicked look, Indu says his class is novice. The man laughs, saying that's the same as having no class at all. The player thinks to himself that his primary class really is novice, but he doesn't need to mention the secondary one. As he lifts the traffic sign again, Taco says he'll get revenge for the other day, and that this is the true power of a launcher. He launches several attacks at the protagonist, who simply dodges them all while closing the distance. The terrified man asks how he could do that right in front of the loan shark. Indu says he really didn't want any trouble before the exam, but he can't do anything when trouble comes looking for him. With just a flick of his arm, he sends a man flying upward. Causing panic among everyone nearby, the loan shark screams desperately as he crashes to the ground. Everyone stares at him, but the protagonist keeps walking, claiming it was self-defense. Inside an extremely luxurious facility, the attendant informs him that the registration fee is 8,000 yen, and he thinks that's incredibly expensive. Sometime later, he was sitting there depressed about losing 8,000 yen, but suddenly someone approaches him. It was a girl apologizing for the delay. With a smile, she says they will now begin his rank certification exam. He stood before a massive black rock. It was emanating a powerful purple light. Indu notes the exam is apparently just as he'd heard and asks the girl if he should place his hand on it. He begins to reach his hand toward the great rock. As his hand nears the rock, bolts of lightning connect the two. He brings his hand even closer while a strong blue light emanates upon touching the rock. A massive explosion of light occurs, causing even the assistant to panic. There were several lightning bolts along with an extremely bright light coming from a stone. Still terrified by what she sees, the woman begins to wonder what on earth this is. In another room, the girl, still shocked, calls out his name. She says the result came back, and it's the equivalent of a rank A. Indu receives a document stating his classification. A bit nervous, she says he probably knows this, but players can change classes. She starts explaining he could be a sword master, a mage master, or an archbishop. He refuses, saying that even if he wanted to, his class isn't available yet. Confused, the girl asks what class that would be, but the protagonist replies he has no intention of saying. She informs him that to change classes he'd need a special item and asks if he'd like the association's help. Indu simply rejects her coldly. He asks if that's all she has to say. The woman, a bit flustered, asks if this wouldn't be problematic for him. The player asks her why she's asking that. She explains that although he has more power than any rank they've ever seen, because he has no class, he will be downgraded to rank E. The girl informs him that rank E has many restrictions, like not being able to create his own guild, which would be a huge disadvantage. Indu says the government loves creating useless rules, thinking to himself that he just needs to turn one of his subordinates into a rank B. He remembers that only one class can complete this game, and he has no intention of changing classes until he gets there. The protagonist asks if even rank E players can receive the 100 million yen reward for clearing the exam. She says yes. The woman says she understands, and his registration will have to be issued with a rank E classification. Shortly after, he was walking down the street while some people held up signs. They were guild members trying to recruit people who had just finished the exam. The protagonist, with a smirk, notes that people are really putting a lot of effort into this. Two girls say they're looking for ranked E players and ask if he wants to join their guild. Indu informs them that he is rank E. The girls start pitying him, saying they understand. The protagonist notes that rank E players are treated like cockroaches, but convinces himself he doesn't care about any of that. Suddenly, his attention is caught by a man in a suit walking through the crowd. The man had an orange aura surrounding his body. His eyes also glowed orange as he stared intently. The man, approaching, says it's a pleasure to meet him and asks if his name is Indu Ray. Suddenly, he hands a card to Indu, saying it contains his information. It was a card for a guild called Genesis Wings. People whisper among themselves, wondering if that's really the strongest guild, Genesis Wings, and if he is the Fedor. The protagonist asks what Fedor means, and the man, somewhat embarrassed, explains that was his nickname in the game. The player notes he's famous and wonders if he should befriend him since he can make money. He asks Shinji what he wants with him, but their conversation is interrupted by the lone shark, who asks if Fedor was looking for him. Tako approaches, saying that even though he's a rank B player, he won't be swayed by bad decisions. The protagonist wonders if this weakling is really rank B and guesses he might have threatened the examiner. Shinji asks who he is, and the angry lone shark calls him the little lady. Tako fumes and grabs the man by his tie, threatening him and claiming he's strong. However, with a single movement, the man twists his arm with ease. He forces him to his knees while the lone shark groans in pain. Looking a bit more serious, he says they're getting closer to destruction every minute, and thus he has no time for him. Tako retreats angrily while telling Shinji he better not cry if he later tries to recruit him. The man apologizes to the protagonist for the commotion, but Indu says it's fine since it was an inconvenience for him too. The protagonist asks what he wants, since someone like him wouldn't have anything to say to a rank E. The man just laughs and calls him humble, saying the only reason he's rank E is because he refused to change classes. Laughing, The protagonist says it seems the association is way too loose with their tongues. Somewhat awkward, the man says that since the end of Japan is approaching, they can't afford to be careless. Shinji asks him. Indu asks the protagonist what he thinks about working with them, offering the same amount they paid for the information. Upon seeing the check, Indu goes into shock, realizing it's for 10 million yen. He claims it's an amount he possessed a while ago, while internally screaming that he desperately wants that money. The player returns the check, stating he doesn't want to join any guild. Shinji comments that strong people truly aren't satisfied with so little. With that, Fedor makes another proposal, asking if Indu would be interested in the information they possess. He says his guild is backed by government agencies and even other guilds around the world. Looking at him, the protagonist asks if they could discover who the player was that completed prophecy online. Smiling, Shinji responds that it's impossible since no one has ever completed that game. The protagonist, extremely irritated, says that in that case, he'll have to decline the offer. The man gets very frightened seeing his reaction. He says it's all right. Handing him a sheet of paper, he tells him that if he changes his mind, he can contact him. As he leaves the premises, the man wonders why Indu gave up so easily. He wonders if he was worried about tarnishing his guild's name by insisting too much, but he concludes that's not it. Shinji confesses that he was absolutely terrified, as if every part of his body were telling him not to get into trouble with that monster, making Fedor nearly wet himself. The protagonist taps his shoulder. Indu hands him a piece of paper, leaving the man even more confused. He tells him that if he ever needs help, he can call him, and depending on the price, he might accept. Taking the paper, while still very nervous, the man thanks him for the kindness. Still dazed, Shinji wonders who he really is. Later, at the Genesis Wings Guild headquarters, someone was walking hurriedly down the hallway. He entered the rooftop area. He formally enters the guild master's office. He announces his return to the master. Suddenly, the master turns around, revealing she is a woman. She asks him how it went meeting the strongest novice, according to the association. Still a bit nervous, Shinji says he truly is a monster. Still trembling, he admits the protagonist was the only player who ever made him feel fear through a simple conversation. With a terrifying gaze, the guild master asks who will be stronger between her and Indu. He stammers, hesitating to answer. She says she'll take his silence as an answer while observing the protagonist's file. Still very nervous, Shinji says he is deeply sorry. Tsukino says he doesn't have to apologize, as his job is to convey all information without hiding anything. The guild master mentions that of the 10 transcendentals, she is undoubtedly the lowest level, and therefore, it's not surprising there are people stronger than her. She explains that the 10 transcendentals are the best from the Prophecy online beta test, those who receive the cash prize. Tsukino also informs that in a world where a game has become reality, the appearance of someone powerful alters the power hierarchy. She observes that since Shinji returned alone, it means the negotiation failed. He says, apparently, the protagonist is not interested in the information they possess, much less the 10 million offered. With her hands crossed, she says that if he truly is one of the 10 transcendentals, fame and money are just a matter of time for him. She notes it's impossible for one of the 10 to voluntarily remain a novice. Tsukino comments that, on the other hand, there are hidden items that are extremely powerful but also have side effects. She says that regardless, she must continue evaluating the man with her own eyes. And if her assessments are correct, he will certainly become the strongest in the world. The master says that in any case, the strongest person in the world could only be one of the 10 transcendentals whose name is unknown. Nervous, Shinji asks if she is talking about the first place ranker. He informs that even the United States searched for the data of the top 10. However, the data for number 1 was corrupted. Tsukino hypothesizes that the United States is lying about number 1's data and is secretly hiding him in their country. Shinji says he also believed the rumors, but after seeing Indu in person, recalling the protagonist, Fedor says it's very likely he really is number 1. The master says if he is saying that, then there's a high probability they are correct. Looking out her window, she says Shinji must inform all members that it is strictly forbidden to take hostile actions against Indu. She mentions that a nuclear bomb, whose explosion time is unknown, must be handled with extreme care. Still very nervous, he says he will do exactly as requested. On the other side of town, in another large building, Indu informs that a few weeks have passed and they were looking for places to use as a hideout for a source of income. He was looking at the view when suddenly someone called him. His subordinates were setting up the television and asking for his opinion. Koki presents him with a suitcase full of money, saying he secured today's tributes. The protagonist praises him while asking how the preparation for the raid team is going. He says they are leveling up easily in the underground sewers and are earning 1 million a day. Excitedly, he informs him that even the new recruits are earning 100,000 yen a day. Extremely happy, the long-haired man says he never imagined earning so much money while thanking the protagonist. The player reminds him that he said he'd make them money. After all, if they win, he wins too. He mentions that the tributes are practically fees for the information. Koki mentally thinks that paying 90% really is a lot, but without the information, he couldn't even make 10%. Looking at the protagonist, he observes that this man possesses very valuable information. The long-haired man asks what they will do about the trial, since only 10 days remain and the reward value is already at 400 million. The protagonist tells him he's going to wait a bit longer. Suddenly, Indu is drawn to the television, which is reporting something. It showed the location where the trial was taking place, reporting that if they fail to complete it in 10 days, Japan will be destroyed. Another anchor says that just like at the beginning, the situation seems desperate. Her colleague mentions they have new information. She announces that the Japanese government has declared it will pay 1 trillion yen to whoever manages to finish the trial. Looking at the announcement, the player says if they delay any longer, foreign guilds might try to do it. Taking a piece of clothing, he says now is the best time. He gets dressed, saying he's going out for a bit, while the long-haired man asks if he's going alone. Indu responds, of course, because after all, he can't put his source of income in danger. Everyone is surprised by him. However, the 171 ranker gets furious and says it's 1 trillion, so he'll keep it all for himself. Koki comes to his senses, realizing it's all about the money. It was already night when he finally arrived at the trial site. There were many people in front of the gate leading to the trial. The protagonist approached while Shinji noticed his presence. The player, as always, was calm, as if he were happily going to the market. Fedor asks if he really came. Passing by him, Indu says he has no intention of cooperating. However, Shinji says that's a shame since he wanted to make a lucrative deal with him. He informs him it would only be transporting some things for 100 million, making the protagonist give him his full attention. Shinji takes him to a space where there were hundreds of backpacks. He tells him he'd like the protagonist to take one of those backpacks to his members who are inside the trial. Curious, Indu asks what's inside them to be worth 100 million. Shinji replies that they are provisions. Opening one of the backpacks, he realizes they are full of supplies. He asks what that's about, and Fedor tells him they're his guild master's favorite foods. Shinji explains they are in the deepest layer of the trial, and thus are running out of supplies. With a smile, the protagonist asks what the problem is, since many people would accept for that amount of money. Somewhat awkward, he says that in reality, they are in a difficult situation. Shinji informs that he already requested this from 39 groups, but all were completely annihilated. The player begins to wonder if the first 4 floors are just formalities, questioning if it differs from the original game. Still very nervous, the man concludes that he was sure Indu knew something. The player starts saying that in the mere first 4 layers there should only be formalities and wonders if it's different from the game. Everyone who manages to reach the 5th layer is currently hunkered down there, waiting for supplies. He continues, noting that the only people who could call the 4th layer a mere formality are Indu and his guild master, as he picks up the backpack. The protagonist asks if they're really that short-staffed, but either way, he's making bank. Looking at Fedor, he asks if he'd get a bonus for delivering it ahead of schedule. Grabbing his cell phone, he says he'll check with his superiors. Watching the man talk on the phone, Indu wonders just how much money he can squeeze out of them. He informs the player that if he delivers within a day, they'll add an extra 50 million. Suddenly, Shinji hears a strange noise. It was the protagonist turning away quickly, stating he'd be there in an hour. Inside the trial, on the 3rd layer, a group was struggling against a giant insect. The man was trying to hold off the monster's attacks while being pinned down. Still restraining the monster, he begs the woman to flee. Even if she has to go alone, she calls out to him, pleading for her husband to come with her. Her husband looks back with a smile, thanking her for everything and telling her to run. She screams his name, reaching out her arm, trying to grab him. Unexpectedly, the protagonist slices right through the insect, saying they're in his way. The man falls to the ground in terror as chunks of the massive monster collapse around him. Still in shock, he can't process how he's alive, while his wife thanks Indu for saving him. But in the blink of an eye, the player is already miles away, leaving them both confused about what just happened. As the protagonist traverses the cave at an impressive speed, they wonder if he's already gone. Finally, he reaches the 5th layer, coming to a halt. Indu realizes it didn't even take him an hour and concludes that those 150 million yen will be a sweet profit. But suddenly, he's confused when he notices something. It was a man asking if he was Indu, setting the backpack on the ground. The protagonist asks if the man is from Genesis Wings, which he confirms. He tells him he brought the supplies that Shinji requested for delivery. The man informs him that the payment was deposited into his account the moment he set off, as Fedor assured them he would deliver. Opening his bank app, he realizes that 150 million yen have indeed been transferred to him. Satisfied, he simply thanks them for the business. As several players appear, their leader informs them they have been waiting for food for a long time. They begin distributing the provisions, saying they're finally safe, while one says he'll alert the front line. The protagonist remarks that the situation looks horrific, and the leader agrees. He informs the player that they've already lost a massive number of people. Unexpectedly, many people start running. They scream that they will catch them as they approach the camp. They claim they're safe now, while the leader asks what happened. But before they can answer, a deafening noise echoes through the cave, causing everyone pain. They look ahead, where a massive cloud of smoke emerges, much to everyone's surprise. A huge swarm of giant insects is heading straight for them. The protagonist was preparing to strike, when suddenly a massive flame blasts past him, leaving him completely stunned. The guild master rushes past him, incinerating all the insects. After destroying them all, she stops, her sword still wreathed in flames. The charred corpses of the insects rain down. He realizes that's a high-level secret skill, Hellfire Elemental Blade. The woman approaches him, saying it's a pleasure to meet him. She thanks Indu for taking on the transport mission. As she sheathes her sword, she introduces herself as the guild master. Still putting her sword away, she walks toward him, casting a stern look his way, but to break the tense atmosphere, Tsukino ends up tripping and apologizes, saying she hasn't eaten in 2 days. While the other members squabbled over food, the protagonist comments that they really seem to be struggling with supplies. A bit later, they both head toward the tents. Seated at a table, Indu asks the guild master if she's the strongest there, to which she says yes. With her mouth full of food, Tsukino says that even though she's the weakest among the 10, she's still part of the Transcendentals. Not fully understanding, he asks who would call themselves by such a ridiculous name. Embarrassed, the guild master clarifies she didn't name herself. That's what everyone calls the top 10 players from the game. Confused, the protagonist asks who measure their power. Tsukino informs him that the names of the 10 were revealed after an investigation by U.S. intelligence, with the exception of one, the one at the top of the list, number 1. She explains they received a reward from the organization and asks if Indu hasn't received anything. Curious, he asks how much she got. Tsukino explains it varies by country of residence, and since she's in Japan, she received 1 million. He remembers that specific amount was what left him in that state. The protagonist concludes it would be better to hide the fact that he is number 1, as that could mess up his plans. He asks if that amount isn't too small compared to what one gets from clearing a dungeon. Tsukino assumes it seems like little, but thanks to the game, she acquired much more valuable knowledge. However, even with that knowledge, she wasn't able to defeat the trial boss. The protagonist asks if even a top 10 player wasn't enough, to which she replies they are still just human. The woman comments that if she had her in-game levels and gear, she could do it, but in her current state, it's practically impossible. He places his hand on the table as he stands up. Indu says he has completed his mission and that, if she wants more of his services, she can hire him by providing a handsome reward. The protagonist begins to leave, assuming he must finish off the boss as fast as possible to secure his 1 trillion yen. Suddenly, Tsukino jumps up, screaming desperately for him to wait. She asks if Indu couldn't help them defeat the boss. Her subordinates are against it, saying they don't want someone like him with them in battle. Irritated, the master asks them if she hadn't forbidden any type of insult toward Indu. Tsukino says she understands them, but either way, she doesn't plan on losing any more of her friends. as she remembers how they were slaughtered by a giant spider. She also recalls attacking the spider with extreme force, yet failing to deal any damage. Her comrades were screaming that they couldn't hold out any longer. She orders them to take the wounded and get out of there. One of the soldiers is against her decision, saying if they flee, the others will have been sacrificed in vain, but she replies she wants to avoid more deaths. Another guild member steps forward, asking Tsukino to let them face the boss while she escapes. But before he can do anything, the man is sliced in half. The master is horrified upon seeing this. The man's body falls right in front of her. She becomes incredibly enraged seeing what happened. Dejected, Tsukino admits that if there's a chance Indu can beat the boss, she wants to bet on it. Everyone remains silent, clearly uncomfortable and nervous, not knowing what to say. The guild master screams that they must bring peace back to Japan and honor the sacrifice of all those people. Many of her subordinates are moved by the words she spoke in front of the exit. Indu says he doesn't want anyone slowing him down. With a confident smirk, he says he can face the boss on his own. Seeing him with such certainty, Tsukino confesses that he truly must be one of the Transcendentals. Watching the protagonist leave the cabin, the master wonders how he's going to fight and decides to witness him in the battle against the boss. She follows him, asking if he hadn't said he'd take any job as long as it was well rewarded. Desperate, Tsukino begs Indu to join her party to face the monster. The malicious little thief realizes that a massive profit is about to come his way. Turning to her, Indu asks if the master is eyeing the reward. Tsukino tells him he can keep the reward as an inconvenience fee. With a wicked grin, Indu says he accepts, but each person must pay him 10 million yen. And there are two more conditions. Half the payment must be made up front, and the other is that they can't speak a word of what they see during the battle. Furthermore, he doesn't guarantee their safety, and the survivors can split the money of those who don't make it. Shocking everyone, Tsukino says it seems. The negotiations are officially over. Irritated, the master orders everyone to prepare to move out. As he watches them, Indu thinks to himself that he'll easily pocket 1 trillion after everyone pays up. Suddenly, they hear a swarm of buzzing sound approaching. They look toward the noise, trying to figure out what's happening. It was several giant insects closing in on them. The protagonist says he could wipe them all out for a good fee, but Tsukino refuses, saying it won't be necessary. She already begins to summon her flames, stating that these insects are interrupting her meal. The master uses an attack called Hellfire Whirlwind. Indu mentally admits that wasn't half bad. After her attack, Tsukino sheaths her sword once more. She quickly finishes eating her energy bar. With a respectful nod, the master turns and calls for the protagonist. He shows her his phone, saying he has already received the money. With that, they can finally go liberate Japan. Everyone heads toward the boss room. They push into the depths of the dungeon, crushing every monster in their path. One of the players asks Tsukino if Indu isn't a bit too plain. The bald man comments that because of the protagonist's extreme confidence, he had imagined Indu would use massive, flashy attacks. Clearly exhausted, Tsukino tells the bald guy to watch the way he kills the monsters. The man observes that the monsters were defeated with a single blow, leaving no traces of damage on their bodies. The guild master admits he truly is highly skilled, leaving her subordinate even more confused. Mentally, she realizes the protagonist makes no unnecessary movements, as if he doesn't even have to try. Continuing to observe him, Tsukino remarks that if he lives up to her expectations, the boss will definitely be defeated. After some time, they stand before the boss's door, staring at the massive portal. Indu thinks it's been a long time since he was last here. Unexpectedly, the bald guy starts complaining about how cold it is while a healer tries to help him. Tsukino passes them, saying they must go, as she draws her sword. She says they must avenge the sacrifice of their fallen comrades. Preparing to enter, the master says everyone must use their full strength right from the start. Everyone follows her, shouting and brandishing their weapons. The massive spider was looming above them, with the protagonist still entering the room calmly. This was the 5th-floor boss, the Scarlet Spider. Suddenly, Tsukino, along with 2 other subordinates, attacks the spider. This triggers a massive explosion that shakes the entire room. Some guild members start celebrating, saying they finally defeated the boss, but Indu coldly denies it. He says it's not over yet. As Tsukino looks up in terror, the monster launches a massive attack toward them. To everyone's shock, the boss doesn't have a single scratch. Stunned, Sakino begins to question why it didn't work, even though the monster is weak against fire. After all, it's an insect type. Apathetically, Indu comments that the monster is still weak against fire, but they just don't have enough power. Suddenly, the spider launches a massive strike at the master. With great difficulty, she manages to dodge, but her companions aren't so lucky. Sakino warns them to watch out for the webs, as they are sticky and impossible to escape. Another attack comes flying at them. Unexpectedly, Indu skillfully grabs the two guild members who are near him. He leaps to save them while holding them both. He lands on the ground, letting them both drop, still on the floor. The man apologizes to the protagonist. Looking at him, Indu tells him he doesn't need to thank him. After all, he loses 10 million if one of them dies. He coldly adds that if he has to save him again, he'll charge an extra million. Watching the fight, Indu thinks it might be good to let the battle drag on to save them and make more money, but he decides that acting that way could ruin future negotiations. He activates Soul Eyes. He realizes that to obtain its soul fragment, he needs to cause the greatest shock Sakino has ever had in her life. Then, he prepares to attack, deciding he must use something very flashy. In an instant, he is already above the monster. The protagonist takes his dagger, invoking a powerful attack. He delivers a strike, slicing off one of the monster's legs. The great spider tries to attack him again. A massive impact occurs, shattering the entire floor with the sheer force. All the guild members, along with the master, try to shield themselves with their arms. Looking at the massive cracks, Sakino is shocked and loses hope, realizing that not even Indu could do it. But surprisingly, the protagonist was holding the monster's leg with his bare hand. He was using a skill called Soul Strength. Everyone is extremely stunned by what he just did. With that, he begins to spin the monster like a Beyblade, tossing the giant spider to the side. Still, dazed, the monster remains on the ground. As the protagonist approaches, looking at the boss, he remembers the spider's weakness is in its abdomen. With just one flick of his dagger, he manages to cut the monster open. The attack was so powerful it caused a blinding flash. One of them shouts, celebrating the protagonist's victory, but Indu asks if he's misunderstanding something. Unexpectedly, a red mist begins to emanate from the giant spider's body. That mist forms a massive cloud above them. They realize their visibility is being compromised. However, suddenly the giant spider begins to emit red lightning with a dark aura. They are absolutely shocked to see that it has regenerated. Furthermore, it has grown even larger than before. With a smirk, Indu informs them that this is the spider's second form, being even more voracious than the first. In total fear of what's happening, they wonder what to do now, since they couldn't even face the first form. While using the skill Soul Thread, Indu calls them weak. After that, he begins to sprint around the monster. In the blink of an eye, the protagonist appears above the spider with his threads tangled all around the boss. At that moment, he uses a skill called Soul Incineration Array. Sakino orders them to retreat as fast as possible. Raising his dagger with a deadly gaze, Indu commands the monster to burn. A massive flame engulfs the giant spider's body. Both the bald guy and the master look on in terror, realizing his firepower is dozens of times greater than Sakino's. However, he looks at the monster, slightly confused. A massive curtain of flames formed right in front of them. Everyone is happy because it's finally over. However, one of them notices something unusual. It was a massive mountain of crystals formed from the spider's body. They wonder just how rare a drop like that must be. The protagonist tells them to get out, but the other players suddenly get angry with him. To everyone's shock, the monster's legs, which had been crystallized, begin to tremble. Both Sakino and Indu understand exactly what is happening. He says this is the final form of the Earth Trial Monster, and if they manage to defeat it, they can live in peace from here on out. Everyone present begins to take a fighting stance again as something emerges from the monster's body, just like her subordinates. The master is also shocked and worried about what is unfolding. Unexpectedly, some people begin to be attacked by a sort of antennae. The spider starts destroying everything around it. While dodging the attacks, Sakino notes that its strikes are much wider and faster. With great difficulty, she manages to dodge another attack that passes dangerously close to her body. The master looks back nervously, trying to understand what is going on. Suddenly, Indu approaches her and tells her to take everyone toward the entrance. Sakino asks him what he's going to do, but the protagonist replies that he doesn't need to explain the obvious. While dodging attacks and closing the distance with the monster, Indu says he's going to finish it off and take its drops. Observing all this, Tsukino is stunned, realizing that he manages to avoid the spider's blows with total ease. The protagonist says the monster will attack indiscriminately until everyone is finished, mentioning that they are just getting in his way. Still closing the distance, Indu admits that although he can dodge everything, his biggest concern is how to actually kill the beast. He strikes one of the antennae, but surprisingly, it didn't cause even a single scratch. The spider looks at him as if it were mocking him. As another attack heads his way, the protagonist realizes that not even his goat dagger can pierce that armor. He leaps, deciding he must open up a weak point. With that, Indu activates his soul reservoir. The soldiers wonder what he's doing, jumping so high and leaving himself defenseless. With a manic smile, the guy starts screaming for the monster to attack him. Obliging his request, the spider impales him with its antennae. Everyone is left extremely shocked and terrified upon seeing that. Tsukino screams, calling out the protagonist's name. However, the madman keeps on smiling. Looking at the spider, the protagonist laughs and says he finally caught it. Even a monster gets spooked seeing this. Quickly, Indu raises his dagger. He uses his skill Soul Barrier. Unexpectedly, the protagonist begins launching several slashes through the air toward the monster. The strikes head straight for the base of the antennae. With that, he manages to break the antennae, forcing the monster to let him go despite his fall. He keeps staring at the spider while smiling. The monster explodes into several pieces, causing a massive blast. He falls to the ground while several crystals fly toward him. Opening his system, he decides he needs to recover at least enough so he doesn't suddenly die. Several artifacts begin to be used on him: High Heal, Elemental Cure, and Damage Recovery. Surprisingly, Tsukino, accompanied by some subordinates, is near his body healing him. Then, he sits up, thanking them for their help and saying that thanks to them, he didn't have to waste his own skills. Looking at his fully healed body, the protagonist says the master has excellent healers. Irritated, Tsukino asks him if he took those attacks on purpose. Standing up, Indu affirms that this is the real prophecy online. Once again smiling like a lunatic, the protagonist says that taking hits without dying is a basic skill. Both Tsukino and the soldiers are horrified by what he said. Still nervous, the woman says that they are in the real world now. Indu explains that as far as combat strategies go, both in the game and now in reality, they all work the same way. She gets even more freaked out by him. She concludes that something is definitely not right with the protagonist. Suddenly, the system notifies that he has met the requirements and obtained a D-type swordsman soul fragment. It also announces the end of the trial, making everyone start celebrating and praising Indu. The players are happy because Japan is safe. Indu calls the master over and tells her they need to discuss the rewards before the session closes. He says that although they agreed he'd take everything, Tsukino could receive it in his place and then wire it to him. Confused, the woman asks why Indu wants her to receive it instead. The protagonist says he wants to give the credit to her, as it would be better than saying an unknown novice defeated the boss. Besides, if it's reported that a major guild defeated the spider, they'll increase the reward for the next boss. While everyone feels awkward, Indu decides it will be harder to make money if his identity is discovered. Feeling a bit embarrassed, the woman asks if all of this is just for the money. Tsukino explains she doesn't feel right taking the credit, but Indu tells her that her guild hired him for this job for 1 trillion yen. The guild master simply gives in and says she will do as requested. After Tsukino enters her guild's name, the protagonist is satisfied with the fact that his information is safe. After all, if his info leaked, the guild would be announcing they took credit for something they didn't do. A helicopter begins to fly over the trial region. The journalist reports that the earthquakes haven't stopped since this morning and that the epicenter is at the site of the Earth trial. While flying over a crater, she reports the site is collapsing, causing players to retreat. The entire mountain begins to crumble while some people try to escape. Everyone who is in the boss room begins to be teleported. They're brought back to the surface. The protagonist lands calmly on the ground. The couple the protagonist saved embraces, happy to have survived. Before them stood a grand and imposing structure. Tsukino, looking at it, affirms that apparently it's all over. On the structure, It is inscribed that the name of the team that passed the trial, Genesis Wings, will be engraved there. Dozens of reporters start rushing toward the players, asking which guild managed to defeat the boss. They point at Tsukino and her subordinates, saying they're the subjugation members. Looking at the crowd, the master realizes the journalists are gathering. She turns, asking Indu if they can really take the credit. But at that moment, everyone realizes that he's simply vanished. The blonde guy informs his leader that the protagonist left a letter. In the letter, the scoundrel said that if she had anything lucrative to do, she could feel free to call him. Reporters approach Tsukino directly, trying to ask her various questions while being blocked by the other members. The woman calms the blonde guy, telling him everything is fine. Suddenly, the master begins to prepare to give a speech. With a smile, she announces to the Japanese people that this is something she feels proud to speak about. With her chest puffed out, she says that Genesis Wings managed to conquer the dungeon. Still wanting more information, the journalists wait for more details in her speech. Unexpectedly, she announces that they wouldn't have achieved this through their efforts alone. While someone walks through the forest, she says they achieved it thanks to everyone's help. Koki, along with the skinny guy, had gone to look for Indu. He remains clearly satisfied. As Tsukino thanks everyone who participated, all members, including the master herself, bow before the cameras, thanking everyone. Even the reporters begin to consider this an admirable attitude and name them the strongest guild. She raises her head again, smiling. Back in his hideout, Indu, he notes that Tsukino did a great job. He assumes, mentally, that he could make a fortune if he were famous, but he'd constantly be hounded by the media. With a chilling gaze, the protagonist decides he needs to prepare a face to show the public. He tells his subordinates he's hungry and orders them to stop somewhere. News regarding the end of the Earth trial spread rapidly. People were gathered around tables while the TV announced that Japan is the second country to clear a trial. People watched the news with a certain level of hostility. In the building where the protagonist's office was located, someone was weighing feelings against money. Seated, Indu realizes he has received the 1 trillion. Some subordinates discuss what the protagonist said, but soon give up, knowing they won't see a cent of that money. They were minting a type of currency. While complaining that they didn't even know why they were doing it, one asks why, but another yells at him to shut up and keep going. Since the words of the scrivener, Indu, are absolute. Suddenly, the protagonist asks if Rumi's guild has been registered yet. The girl says yes, and that they've already been approved. Rumi, somewhat embarrassed, asks if it's really okay for her to become the leader of the Golden Farm Guild. He says only rank B or higher players can become guild leaders. With a smile, Indu says a rank E like him can't open one. The protagonist recalls that after leveling everyone up with his info, he saw his farmers reach rank B or higher, but still, some go further than others. He explains that Rumi might be the least suited to lead, but she gets along with everyone, helping hold the guild together. Unexpectedly, the long-haired man approaches the protagonist, saying Rumi has already become an internet sensation, and the entire guild was being called the high-rank guild since every member is rank B or higher. Seeing all this, Indu concludes that becoming the scrivener was the best choice. Koki asks why the protagonist wants a guild if he could make plenty of money with just his own strength. He explains that one of his goals is to clear the trials. Indu also informs them that some trials affect countries. Others affect continents, states, cities, etc., and only guilds recognized by national governments can accept those service requests. Rumi approaches, handing him a tablet, and saying, "These are easy challenges with big rewards." He rejects the list and says they will take the trial written on that paper. The girl notices the reward is only 5 million and asks if there aren't better requests with the same difficulty level. Koki approaches the skinny guy, asking if the protagonist is crazy for accepting that request. But Rumi says that since the mission caught his eye, there's probably more to it than they can see. With a terrifying look, he confirms it and orders her not to interrupt his requests. The girl gets scared, saying she understands. Rumi announces they will complete our protagonist's previous request and confirms the reward is 5,040,000 yen. Indu shows little emotion and tells her she did a good job. He also informs her he'll be in the trial zone that was demarcated in about 30 minutes. Something interesting to mention here is, remember, when he was impressed by just 1 million, well, that humility is long gone while he speaks with her. He receives another call on his second phone. Upon answering, it's Yuji informing him, while striking a pose in front of a massive white space, that he's doing what the protagonist asked, watching the trial site. The problem is some strange people arrived and entered. When the protagonist asks how many, he replies about 5, and according to him, none of them noticed him. So our protagonist has the record and plan to do something about it. After hanging up, we see that the contact name Indu gave Yuji is Moneymaker 2. After hanging up, our protagonist starts thinking that to enter a trial unauthorized, those people must not be decent folk. So as expected, Indu decides to hide his face by creating an item called the Mask of Illusions. Logically, he uses some materials, and the key item is exactly what he won from Tsukino, the D-type swordsman soul fragment. However, with this, the success rate is only 0.23 with automatic creation. So he decides to cancel and perform a manual creation. The problem is the success probability is completely uncertain, and if creation fails, he could suffer psychological or physical damage. The system even asks if he really wants to continue with this nonsense, but since Indu is shrewd, he does it with pleasure and transports directly to the soul world. As he enters this world, his body is completely inverted, observing the small library. The system warns him he must harmonize with his own soul. The success rate depends on the integrity of his soul. At first, he observes a vast number of pieces, like Lego, that he must assemble to harmonize his soul. Since the success rate is under 1, the difficulty is much higher than normal. Furthermore, the time limit is only 60 minutes. While he continues assembling and modeling, searching for the best shape, he ends up forming an almost perfect sphere. Even the system notifies him that he has harmonized his soul in a perfectly harmonic manner. So, you know the deal. The 0.23 probability rate was added to the probability he created with the harmonization, which was plus 99.77. Thanks to this, he managed to return to the material world with a 100 success rate and the completed item. He returns to the real world with the mask already in hand, a soul smith who has finished his creation. As soon as he places the item in his inventory, he tells his driver to drop him off right there. So he stands in the middle of the street and puts on the mask. With it, his appearance completely changes, transforming into a blonde man with blue eyes and white clothes. He begins to enter the trial site where Yuji and the 5 people went in. Upon getting inside, he already notices the bodies of dead monsters on the floor. These monsters are dismantled armor, and the smell of burning is still fresh in the air. He realizes that apparently there were no issues for the people who enter before him. He keeps advancing to the lower floor, where he notices that in the middle of a large library shelf, a secret door is already open, indicating they've already passed through. As he expected, they were looking for the secret challenge. Challenges are divided into large and small scale, depending on their purpose. Large-scale challenges involve multiple countries, while small-scale ones can be resolved by cities, villages, or guilds. Logically, small-scale ones have much lower difficulty compared to large-scale ones. But their rewards are also much lower, though there are exceptions like those with secret areas. These areas are generated from a small-scale challenge. But inside these areas, the difficulty is much higher. In addition to being unrelated to the main mission of the challenge, they can also contain several rare items inside. Therefore, it makes sense those people are there. In other words, players with a lot of information will always focus on these spots. As he descends the staircase, he senses the presence of others and encounters a group of 5 hooded people. One of them, with white hair and green eyes, takes the lead and asks the protagonist if he's from the gold farm, saying he was waiting for him. This surprises the protagonist, but to play it cool, he just asks what that is. The white-hair man responds that he probably made a mistake, but regardless, he begins saying that from what he observed, Indu has the capacity and skill to conquer that secret challenge. However, our protagonist interrupts him immediately, saying he has no intention of conquering the challenge they hit. But the man tells him that's not necessary. He just tells him that they had already conquered that challenge anyway, and then reveals a box from his inventory. It is the box of evolution. He asks if he didn't come there for that, and the protagonist logically recognizes they were faster. But since the atmosphere is not at all pleasant, he quickly draws his sword and keeps it hidden behind his blade where no one can see, asking what would happen if he wanted something. Surprisingly, the man just gives him a box, telling him he'd give it to him as a symbol of friendship between them, and in exchange, he just wants the protagonist to accept a mission. It's a relatively simple mission. Prevent people from conquering a small-scale challenge. He could do whatever he wanted. He continues, saying that as a player he knows places like that, and it will surely be easy for him to annihilate simple players looking to complete a small-scale challenge. Indu, logically, reflects on why they would want him to interfere with the conclusion of a challenge, but then stops as he finally understands and asks aloud if they're perhaps from the Shadow Guild, asking if they want to do the same thing they did in Argentina. Thinking back to a few weeks ago in Mendoza, Argentina, they failed a simple, small-scale challenge, and the city was completely wiped out. The catch was that a week prior, massive amounts of stocks in Mendoza were sold off, as if someone had predicted the disaster. Everyone claimed a Shadow Guild was behind it, but the protagonist never imagined they'd already have agents operating in Japan. The white-haired man simply told him to let his imagination run wild regarding their motives and asked if he was going to accept the deal or not. But of course, Indu rejects the offer. It's a tempting proposal, but destroying an entire city isn't something he's down for. The Shadow Guild leader calls it a pity, but since he declined, he demands the box back since it belongs to them. They claim they'll charge a small interest fee for lending in the box for a moment. Logically, Indu asks what that fee might be. According to the white-haired man, the protagonist's life is the interest. From the moment he heard that request, Indu had no choice, cooperate or die. But naturally, Indu questions if they really think they can take him down. Even the white-haired man knows that normally it would be impossible. But since they were the ones who cleared the secret challenge, Indu shouldn't underestimate them. He decides to show him why, as they all pull out syringes and jab them into their necks. With his green eyes glowing, the man warns him that against the Shadow Guild, a player's skills become completely useless. They toss the syringes to the floor and start acting erratic. As if poisoned, their bodies twist and writhe in intense pain. But their leader just starts laughing. Our protagonist braces himself, expecting the worst. By the looks of it, those syringes were some kind of doping items. Indu wonders if such things even exist within the trials. Looking closely, there's no visible change, and he truly knows nothing about items like these. But taking a closer look at the box, our protagonist finally understands what's happening and decides to play along for now. While he's thinking this, the white-haired man pulls a remote from his pocket and clicks it, causing the box in our protagonist's hands to explode completely, leaving them all laughing. They comment that players are incredibly easy to handle, since they all fall for simple traps like that. It's exactly because they try to fight like it's a game that they fail. He drew attention to their bodies and pulled it from the small box. But he said it was a shame no one had completed his request. Amidst the smoke, the protagonist calmly says he might not have finished the request, but he's going to take a good look and decide what to do with their items. Shocking everyone, he reveals the explosion didn't touch him at all. Only the box in the middle was destroyed. As they desperately look around, it's already too late. Our protagonist begins knocking them out one by one with extreme speed. Trying to counter, the leader of the Shadow Guild cell attempts to launch fire magic at our protagonist, but he ends up hitting all his own allies instead of him. When they try to complain, the one called Rich Sand simply tells them to hurry up and die, burning up along with our protagonist. However, he simply vanishes in the flames and reappears behind the man, now without the disguise, asking if he really committed friendly fire just to get a hit. It was a complete failure. Then, taking advantage of the distraction, he uses Soulbind, trapping the man in several glowing chains. Clearly enraged, the man asks how it's possible for our protagonist to move after taking an explosion like that to the chest. Indu simply asks if the man really thought that, out of everyone, he wouldn't recognize the true weight of a box of evolution. Stating that from the start, he noticed the box was rigged with explosives. And just like the white-haired man, we all wonder why he did nothing if he already knew. The answer is simple. An explosion like that is nothing to him. This man is severely underestimating high-level players. As for his torn clothes, he'd settle that debt later. He starts calling Rumi while explaining that if the man gives him everything in his wallet, he might forgive him. The man panics, asking if he's calling the cops, but Indu denies it. This is much more important than jail. Rumi answers in her office while checking papers, asking if our protagonist finished up. Without much preamble, he asks her to find a place in Japan with a high volume of stock sell-offs, as it's likely being targeted by the Shadow Guild. She says she understands, and our protagonist hangs up while the man, still tied up, asks if Indu is trying to play the hero of justice. But even the protagonist finds that hilarious, asking what on earth he's talking about. He explains that if a shadow guild is manipulating the market to sell off stocks, it means they're dirt cheap right now. If he buys them all and clears the trial, he'll make a killing. This leaves the white-haired man terrified, wondering if our protagonist is really planning to take on a shadow guild head-on. For the money, Indu doesn't mind making them his enemies at all. He then asks everyone to cooperate with him, all those still on the ground, bruised and burned. They wonder why, but they can't resist. He asks Rumi over the phone if the re-education treatment is ready, while she asks if he'll use the recovery skill. He opens the box to see what's inside. While he looks, she comments that she thinks she can use the items now, but isn't sure if they'll really work, as she suggests they should find ways to test the methods. He says he found the perfect guinea pigs for the experiment and will send them over. Meanwhile, he uses the box of evolution to transform the F-type magic soul fragment into an E-type magic soul fragment. With this, we jump directly to the scene in front of the Museum of Modern Art. He wonders before entering if this really is the place the Shadow Guild is targeting. Rumi confirms, saying Richie and the others were very cooperative with the investigation. Behind her, the entire group is tied up by their feet, being very cooperative indeed. Indu, who is using the mask of illusion to disguise himself, walks through the crowd. Rumi, worried, asks if it's okay to be out like that since they don't know how many enemies there are. He affirms it's not a problem and tells her to just watch the stock prices. That's what's important. She confirms, and after hanging up, we see a post from a man on a random social network looking for a team to clear the challenge for no reward, just to help the city. They would meet right in front of the site. The man who made the post stands on a high point, calling for volunteers to gather before him. This man is the leader, Takiza, who has a burning desire to protect everyone. In the crowd watching the man speak, we see a blonde man, our protagonist in disguise, commenting that it's quite a gathering. There must be at least 100 people there. He says this with the smile of someone who knows how this story ends. The man in the center is moved to see so many people gathered to protect the city for no reward and thanks everyone from the bottom of his heart. He couldn't believe so many joined for a thankless task. With this many people, it should be easy. So, all he has to do is figure out who the spy is before the challenge starts. Takiza alerts everyone to stay quiet and to call for help as loud as possible if they find a strong enemy, as a special force will help. At least he should be thankful, because without a strategy, he could act freely without worrying about being watched. Anyway, he had already seen everything he needed to. He thinks about whether he should lower his guard and change things up. Out of the 107 players participating in this trial, the number of Shadow Guild infiltrators is exactly 106, leaving only him as a normal person. As they enter, Takashi warns everyone to advance carefully. Amidst the crowd, our protagonist, wearing the mask of illusion, which looks like glasses, knows he's being watched. Advancing into this trial, which is quite beautiful with its clean, white appearance and various statues. Even our protagonist notes they look expensive. But while he observes the statues, several people suddenly surround him suspiciously. Since he already knew they were all Shadow Guild members, he wasn't impressed. As they all pull out spray cans and shake them, several surrounding Indu, activate them and launch a massive blast of fire at him. The problem for them is our protagonist simply leaps to dodge the flames, drawing his sword for a take-that sequence. They are all defeated in mere moments, and he remains completely confident, asking them to bring someone stronger next time, calling them undisciplined dogs in the middle of the fight. Suddenly, someone runs toward them screaming, asking what's going on. It's a desperate Takashi. Our protagonist coldly responds that they attacked him, so he simply responded in kind. Takashi says that's terrible and asks if he's okay. But mid-run, he suddenly pulls out a blade and tries to attack our protagonist, who, just to show off, even more than he already has, catches the blade with his fingers. Even Takashi starts wondering why he can't get close. Is this the comfort our protagonist provides? Seeing the attack was failing, Takashi jumped back, escaping the reach of her friend, who shatters the blade with his hands, separating the hilt from the steel, stating that the blade isn't even an in-game weapon, and they are all underestimating him. He tells them they don't need to hide anymore. He knows they're all Shadow Guild lackeys. Takiza completely shifts his posture, showing a malicious grin and saying that since our protagonist knows too much, they don't need dirty tricks anymore. The people around them logically start questioning what he's saying. They thought they were called to protect the place by an environmental group, not the Shadow Guild. It is an environmental group controlled by the Shadow Guild, and he wonders if he hadn't mentioned it. Regardless, he directly asks our protagonist if he wants to join them. Since their job isn't to kill protagonists, but to protect the trial, avoiding a fight would be better for everyone. If he joins, he'd easily offer 50,000 yen, but then thinks better of it and offers 100,000 yen per day to help him. Logically, hearing this, everyone in his small group gets irritated since their pay is only 30,000 yen. He notes that it's incredibly unfair. However, our protagonist is just thinking about how even low-ranking members of the Shadow Guild pull in about 30,000 yen. That's a lot, and if he were his old self, he might have actually considered it. But the current him simply rejects the offer out loud, and since he turned it down, Takiza says he'll have to stick with the original plan, screaming that the first person to touch our protagonist's face and defeat him will be considered the top player of this trial, and he will personally handpick them to receive an extra bonus of 100,000 yen, ordering everyone to work together to take down our protagonist. The problem for all of them is that he already expected this to happen. So while everyone lunges at him in a disorganized and completely random fashion, without a shred of a plan, our protagonist weaves right through them, striking everyone in the back of the neck or the face to incapacitate them with nothing but his bare hands. And their leader, Takiza, who is trying to surprise our protagonist from behind, yells at him not to underestimate a judo graduate. However, Takashi takes a knee to the face from our protagonist. Bad joke, well I tried, and you already liked it, after our protagonist kneels this man in the face. He leaps and places a hand on his head, using soul imprisonment, instantly incapacitating him and then giving him a slap on the back of the neck. Afterward, our protagonist says he's all finished. Looking at the two people left, he thinks those two terrified souls probably didn't know about the Shadow Guild's involvement, so he has no reason to attack them. Regardless, he thinks he could use them more economically by hiring them later if needed, but putting that aside, he ends up calling Rumi and lets her know he accepted a gift from the Shadow Guild, informing her he made a massive haul and just added about 100 candidates to the money farming group. She understands and asks if he really wants to put 100 people through the re-education treatment like what happened with Bill and the others. However, she warns him the instructors won't be able to handle them all since there are too many. But the protagonist denies it, saying they'll just be normal recruits, and the only one who needs re-education is their leader. But mid-conversation, a sword suddenly, enveloped in black lightning, is hurled toward our protagonist, who barely manages to dodge it as it strikes the ground. It acts almost like a conqueror's hockey hack from One Piece. Lightning everywhere, people being blown away, and the protagonist leaps into the air, holding his phone in a pose like he's just flexed an iPhone he bought on an installment plan. After landing, he looks up and says that person has finally decided to show up. A man, wearing a very strange mask, asks him since when he knew he was there. The protagonist informs him he knew from the start, since everyone who fell in just a few hits was clearly just bait. Besides, he is the only one with a vastly different aura, and he warns him that he must have tried to hide it, but that doesn't work on him. The man, seeing this, realizes that our protagonist has noticed so much and says it's no wonder he hasn't found an opening until now. Then he lunges with two laser swords out of nowhere, closing in on our protagonist, screaming to see if he can withstand this attack. And then, an intense fight begins, with one attacking and the other defending. The MC strikes again. The masked man defends, and the masked man starts saying he didn't expect our protagonist to keep up using just a simple dagger, remarking that he's truly grown much stronger since the game days. Our protagonist, naturally weirded out by that comment, advances all at once, attacking directly and slicing the mask right down the middle. Realizing that after all this time, it was him, as the mask hits the floor, the protagonist says it's the first time he's encountered someone he knew from his pro days and didn't realize it. That man is Yudo. Yudo says he's happy to see our protagonist, calling him King, his old nickname in the game. However, he didn't expect to meet like this, since now he'll have to kill him. As he says this, he enters a pose, an epic stance, almost like a Jedi preparing to strike with dual sabers. Indu looks at him as he says this, taking off his own mask and asking if he really thinks he can pull it off. Yudo doesn't even bother answering the provocation, simply positioning both swords and activating his dual-wield skill, screaming as he's enveloped in a purple aura. He has no choice but to be faster than him at first. He lunges, passing by our protagonist like a bolt of lightning, making a gash on his shoulder, and continues with a barrage of attacks that the protagonist can't even seem to react to. However, in the middle of this onslaught, the protagonist says his speed is impressively fast, but unfortunately for him, he can activate soul eyes to enhance his vision, staring intently at Yudo. At his level, the acceleration must be almost at its limit. We also see Yudo's stats. Level 38 class, dual blade combatant, 1050 HP, 145 STR, 154 INT, 215 DX, and 253 AGI. This guy aimed for the flash and hit the mark. In the middle of those subsequent attacks, he tries to surprise our protagonist by attacking his back, but to his shock, Indu simply blocks with one arm, reversing his blade, and then spins, kicking him square in the face and sending him crashing into a wall that shatters on impact. The poor guy even spits out some red liquid, and the protagonist comments that his speed is indeed impressive. But his blades don't have enough power to land a solid hit. And as always, when he defeats someone, he uses soul imprisonment. Yudo is utterly confused as to why he can't move, stating this shouldn't be possible unless there was a massive level gap between them. However, the protagonist confirms it's not just a gap, but an abyss of a level difference. This makes Yudo question once again how this is even possible, to which the protagonist responds that he's just a very talented player, asking why he doesn't just leave the Shadow Guild and join him to make bank. With his skills, he could make a fortune unexpectedly. Yudo responds that it's impossible. When the protagonist asks why, Yudo says he can't answer, thinking he was just dodging the question. The protagonist decides to tighten the soul imprisonment, causing Yudo immense pain. Finally, he screams that it's not that he won't answer, but that he can't. When he tries to say something, he stops, unable to speak about a certain person and what they were going to do. The protagonist catches on and asks about that person, specifically asking about Isashi, questioning if he was somehow being held hostage. Yudo is stunned by the protagonist's perception, realizing there's more to this story than he had managed to see. He decides to release Yudo, who falls like a sack of potatoes. The protagonist thinks back to the past, Prophecy Online, a game so ruthless it drove away anyone who tried to dive deep. While low difficulty areas were manageable, high difficulty ones were practically impossible and lacked any real guidance. In that game, it was extremely hard to find comrades who shared his conviction, like people such as Yudo and his younger brother, Isashi. However, over time, the protagonist began defeating bosses solo, even though the three of them used to fight together at the start. But eventually, the level gap pulled them apart. Though they could no longer venture together, they kept in touch through the game chat. Back in the trial, the protagonist thinks about how he lost contact with them, and the place they finally reunited was right here, in the service of the Shadow Guild. Getting straight to the point, Indu asks Yudo where Isashi is, but Yudo doesn't even know, because the people who captured him never told him where he was. Suddenly, Yudo has a realization and starts asking, almost shouting at the protagonist, if the subclass he chose in real life was Soul Warrior, asking if he could use his skill to find his brother. The protagonist confirms the skill exists, but unfortunately, the world isn't 100 like the game. This is reality now, and in this reality, everything is driven by money. Without a second thought, Yudo offers everything in his wallet, pleading with him to save his brother. Since the protagonist never turns down money, he asks if Yudo has anything belonging to his brother, and he hands him a blue cap. Upon taking it, the protagonist initiates soul search, focusing on Yudo's brother, Isashi Maeda. The problem is, according to the system, the user he was looking for cannot be located because he is already dead. They both wonder if he truly had died, and a system screen appears again, stating that the killer who finished him off was Raven. Yudo starts cursing, saying that bastard killed his brother. The protagonist asks if he knows that man, and Yudo confirms he was the one holding his brother hostage all this time, forcing him to work to keep him alive. But now he's certain of one thing. He's going to kill that guy, no matter what it takes or what happens. And since he can't do it alone, he asks the protagonist how much he wants. If necessary, he'll work his whole life to get the money he asked for, just to help him catch Raven. But the protagonist only says he feels a bit sad about Isashi's death, since he also considered him like a younger brother. This gives Yudo a glimmer of hope, thinking the protagonist will help him. But Indu tells him not to jump to conclusions, as this is the perfect moment to make the biggest profit possible, and he has no time to waste on unnecessary fights that bring no benefit. Yudo tries to beg him to wait, but the protagonist prefers to check his phone. Since he received messages from Tsukino asking if he really went to fight the Shadow Guild at the Museum of Modern Art, and if he actually accepted the mission, the protagonist wonders where she heard about that and asks which mission she's referring to. She explains that the government recently commissioned a mission to eradicate the Shadow Guild's base, with a reward of around 1 billion yen. The protagonist naturally presses her, asking if there really was such a job, demanding to know where she heard about the request, and she confirms it was an unofficial request made to Wings of Genesis, asking her to keep it confidential. And since it's confidential, he asks if she's sure she should be sharing that, but she informs him she's only telling him, adding that according to investigations, the Shadow Guild headquarters has over 10 billion yen in assets from various companies. If he goes, destroys the base, and confirms there was nothing there, the government will likely turn a blind eye. Hearing this, the protagonist gets hyped about the massive amount of money he'd get just by clearing it out, mixing business with pleasure. So he directly asks Yudo if Raven is at the Shadow Guild's main headquarters. Yudo informs him that Raven is just the leader of the Shadow Guild branch in Japan and rarely leaves the main base. Hearing this, the protagonist smirks maliciously and tells Yudo he's changed his mind, giving a thumbs up and saying he'll help with his revenge after all. Moving a bit into the future, Tsukino. The system notifies our protagonist that the police have identified the Shadow Guild's hideout, and local law enforcement is heading there to investigate. He asks if it's the one located on the 12th floor of a specific building. And logically, she asks how he knows this, given she received the info directly from the government. But he simply claims he's conducting his own investigation and notifies her that he's heading there at that very moment. Tsukino is no fool. She asks our protagonist directly if he's nearby and if he could assist with the investigation, as the police won't be able to handle a rebellion if the Shadow Guild resists. Hearing this, the protagonist asks what the reward would be, offering to capture each Shadow Guild member for 100 million and protect each officer for another 100 million, asking for her thoughts. Logically, she finds herself in a tight spot and says she'll negotiate with the government. But if they refuse, the Genesis Wings Guild will cover the costs and pay him personally. The protagonist says the deal is done and notifies Yudo. From what he knows, the police have also identified the Shadow Guild's base in that region. And naturally, Yudo gets fired up, thinking they can catch them faster that way. But the protagonist disagrees, saying that to the Shadow Guild, Yudo is still dead, and he prefers to keep their association a secret to make moving around easier. Since Yudo understands, he replies that he'll simply be waiting for him, warning him that if the Shadow Guild noticed the police movement, the place will be crawling with traps. After splitting up, the protagonist begins walking toward a large crowd gathered around police tape. When he tries to enter, a man stops him, warning that there's a gas leak and access is restricted. However, knowing he's just a government official, the MC informs him that Genesis Wings sent him to help the investigation, asking if he hadn't heard. Not wanting to lose his job, the man apologizes and promises to show the protagonist the way. Once guided, the protagonist reaches a table of people listening to the operation leader. When the protagonist arrives, they celebrate the arrival of reinforcements from the auxiliary guild, Genesis. But apparently, the leader isn't fond of the idea, asking why they need reinforcements, questioning a player who doesn't even know the rules or what to do. He says the investigation is in his hands and doesn't need the protagonist's help. He warns that orders were clear. Officers act alone, and if he tries to get involved, he'll get a massive scolding, while he orders the troops to move forward. Indu stays back, listening to the man's demand without advancing, warning that he doesn't recommend they go in. But since they don't listen, he just waits. Sure enough, shortly after, a massive explosion occurs on one of the floors, sending debris raining down on the team below, including our protagonist. Everyone panics at the falling rubble, but our protagonist is sharp. He uses soul threads to create something like a spiderweb, catching all the falling debris to prevent it from crushing the people. He also takes the chance to weave a web around the building, ensuring no one can escape and securing the structure in case they try to blow up the support base. The protagonist starts complaining about having to rescue the men who went up earlier despite his warnings, and he leaps, using the webs to ascend much more easily. As soon as he enters, he notices that all the officers who went in earlier are sprawled on the floor, including their leader. As expected, it was just an empty room, a trap. And when he realizes none of them have serious injuries, he remembers there's nearly 100 million per person, telling them not to die for the time being. He uses the threads to wrap them up like cocoons. Then he descends like Spider-Man with all of them together. In this one action, he made about 700 million yen. If you count those saved from the debris, it's a total of 1.2 billion. After rescuing them, he simply leaves, saying he's done his part, leaving the people behind wondering if that's truly what a player is like. Even the former leader bows in gratitude for his life. With his hands still in his pockets, the protagonist approaches Yudo and says he's finished there, asking about the police ambush. But the MC just informs him they've already fled, since the police actions were completely exposed. Then he asks Yudo if he has any leads on another base where Raven might be hiding. But he replies that the only base he knew was that one, and he discarded everything the Shadow Guild gave him, including the phone the same day he met the protagonist, saying if they went back to the art museum, they could check for clues on the phone. But sensibly, the protagonist rejects the idea. Going there would likely reveal Yudo's location. Besides, due to the situation, he had already abandoned the relocation goal, explaining that with the police investigating, it would be hard to secure a proper office or warehouse for them to stay. Plus, security cameras could reveal their positions or appearances. Yudo starts thinking of a perfect place based on those instructions. No cameras, easy to defend, and unlikely to draw attention despite crowds. In that case, a dungeon, one rarely visited with poor resources, will be the perfect hideout. Our protagonist confirms that's exactly it, and his guild was already investigating such places. His friend is shocked the protagonist has a guild, asking why it's called Golden Farm. The protagonist replies that his guild and Yudo's are one and the same, and that Yudo was being forced to join it. So he just had to work hard to secure his own livelihood. Confused, Yudo asks if he even gets a choice, but putting that aside, he asks why he doesn't call the guild for help during combat. The protagonist explains it's because they have other jobs and are busy with their own activities. He could call them at any time, but that would reduce his own profits. However, while talking, he receives a massive message, report number 37, stating that in the last month, 36 dungeons nationwide went inactive, 7 in the capital. Among them, the only closed dungeon with fixed spawns is the Fortress of Despair in the Chiba Province Mountains. Since there's no address, they sent a map location link. The protagonist reflects on the message, thinking about the Fortress of Despair. If it's outside the mountain and they eliminated the spawn points, it would be a useful base. It's a low-level dungeon with bad rewards and no visitors, making it the perfect hideout. Putting that aside, he asks Yudo directly if he managed to prepare what he asked for, and he simply says yes. He then asks if the protagonist prepared the other thing requested, and the MC says yes. Meanwhile, Yudo presents our protagonist with a new car, saying this car could easily navigate the mountains, and the protagonist just has to drive as fast as he can. As they get in, he says if they get a fine, don't worry, the protagonist will pay. Yudo shows that the car can actually fly without wings, while the protagonist says that this time they'll capture them before they even think about escaping. Following the GPS, Yudo reaches a point where they can't continue toward the location because the road doesn't go there. He asks if it was time, but the MC just tells him to leave it to him and to just drive safely. Yudo thumps his chest and says to leave it to him. He's got a gold license. As soon as he finishes, the psycho starts accelerating toward the edge of the road, which looks like a cliff, and jumps right off. Smashed through the guardrail so no one stays on the track. Plunging down, continuing at full speed toward the base. The protagonist wonders if he's being serious while the lunatic keeps laughing, finding it all very amusing. At one point, not content with jumping off the road, he literally drives off a precipice, taking some rocks down with the car. In free fall, the protagonist uses his skills to keep the car's center of gravity at the bottom, making it land wheels down, while Yudo keeps saying this is a real thrill. And he's not wrong when they finally impact the ground, even knocking over a tree that was minding its own business. Yudo celebrates landing wheels down, while the protagonist asks if that's what he calls safe driving. Yudo responds that he thought it would be harder for enemies to track them, so he decided to drive down the cliff instead of following the path. He says since it's a good car, they should use its full potential instead of driving normally. After getting out, and observing the dungeon. The protagonist pulls a massive suitcase from the vehicle and then tells Yudo he forgot his luggage. Yudo gets annoyed, asking why he was the driver and now the bellhop, then asks why the suitcase is so heavy, wondering what on earth is inside. The protagonist casually replies they are weapons, explaining it's just the two of them against an entire group, so they should be well armed. He asks if Yudo agrees, and he can't deny it as they reach the fortress. The protagonist and Yudo observe the gate, where some clearly mean-looking and prepared people are stationed. One of them says he's sick of waiting, asking if there's any chance a girl will show up, but the other kills the mood, saying no one goes to this end-of-the-world place. But at least they can deal with any idiot who tries to enter, which is what makes the job a bit more fun. But of course, they only get happy after killing the players. Indu says the place is a nest of scum, while Yudo mentions those mean-looking men were at the last base they visited. The protagonist celebrates that his hunch was correct, even though he wants to attack now. He still takes the trouble to ask Yudo about their security level, but our employee simply tells the protagonist that since the last base was a business office, they didn't need security, but this is different. Besides destroying the other entry points, it seems they've also created a magic barrier on the walls. So, the only way in must be the gate those men are guarding. They've been smart to concentrate all their firepower at one narrow entrance. In other words, as long as they control the gate, they can block any intruder. Yudo claims they can't be careless, as besides those 5, more must be hidden inside waiting for an invasion. According to his count, at least 30 people left the last base and arrived at this one. After the protagonist asks if they're strong, Yudo says they're just subordinates and won't be a problem. But from what he's heard, 3 people inside are on his level: Jack, Kuroki, and Raven. He warns that average players wouldn't stand a chance against those 3. Indu is surprised to hear there are 3 people on or above Yudo's level, saying this invasion will definitely be worth it. Besides, Employee 3 is shocked by the protagonist's calm and confidence in such a situation, saying that's exactly why he's reliable. However, the protagonist warns that when they fight those 3, they mustn't let any subordinates escape, since there's a reward for each one. The best thing they can do is seal the base. Yudo feels a bit impressed that this is all for money. The protagonist asks if there's any other reason to do this. If the reward is high enough, they buy the risk and move forward. But before continuing, he logically asks if Raven is fast at escaping. As soon as he remembers why Yudo is there, he flies into a rage, declaring that not a single one of them will escape, and that they're starting a total confinement plan. Since that's the case, the protagonist says that for a long-term blockade, he'll ask Genesis for direct backup. But if they contact Sakino, a spy might leak the info. The employee asks if they need to keep the Shadow Guild members pinned there until Genesis arrives to prevent an escape. He's absolutely right, but he still wonders if just the 2 of them will be enough. The protagonist confirms they are more than enough. Wasting no time, the protagonist sends a message to Sakino, telling her they've found the enemy base and to send reliable members to secure it as quickly as possible. But since there might be spies in her guild, she must only call upon people she trusts implicitly. Then he informs Yudo that after sending the message, they must charge the gate, take down the guards, and create a total blockade. Yudo says he's got the plan. The protagonist begins a countdown from 5 to 1. As soon as it hits 0, both prepare to charge full force at the gatekeepers. Our dual-wielding friend uses his acceleration skill, instantly cloaking himself in purple lightning and lunging like a bolt at all of them. Attacking the moment, he closes the gap, giving them 0 time to react. He shows no mercy, slaughtering them all. The protagonist congratulates him, noting that despite the heavy burden, he's still incredibly fast. But our friend simply replies that he wouldn't let himself fall behind in a situation like this. Now it's time to gear up for the upcoming battle. The protagonist spins, scattering a bunch of suspicious white orbs across the ground, covering the entire front area of the site. He says everything is set, and they just have to wait for them to come out from inside. After saying this, it becomes clear that a camera was watching them, and shortly after, a massive crowd begins pouring out from the interior, screaming to kill the invaders. The protagonist just feels happy, saying 1,000,000 yen has just lunged at them, noting that this is the perfect time to collect some serious cash. As those idiots charge toward our guys, the protagonist simply states that the money explosion was about to begin. All those white orbs start exploding in sequence, completely wiping out the unprepared men. The two just watch the blast, and after the enemies fall stiff. Our protagonist says that as expected, it's much better to defeat them all at once. Those who were okay after the explosion because they weren't hit couldn't see a thing due to the massive amount of smoke left behind. Even though they had alerted themselves to the next attack, it was useless, since our protagonist dashed right past them, delivering a blow and asking if getting alerted was really the best they could do instead of something useful. The protagonist celebrates taking down at least 100 people so far. Each one is worth $1 million, so he'll likely make more than he would in a week trial. On the other hand, Yudo claims he's also nearly finished with his batch, delivering violent strikes to guys who can't even attempt to react. But while attacking, he notices a man about to strike our MC from behind and yells a warning. But apparently, it was already too late for the guy who simply forgot to bring his head along with his body, with Yudo passing him at high speed, Deadpool versus Wolverine style. But even so, Yudo knew our MC had already noticed that man, but he couldn't show his hand in front of the camera that was watching them. Furthermore, he asked his partner Yudo not to call him by his name, as there doesn't seem to be a microphone on the camera, but they could still read his lips. In the end, it seems they've provoked them enough for now. The protagonist looks at the camera and says it's in his way, so he'll just destroy it, preparing a slash to cut off the feed of those monitoring them. He takes a chunk of the wall out in the process too, in a room where several Shadow Guild executives were watching through the camera. Raven informs them that they are finally arriving. A woman who appears to be the secretary tells them one of the attackers is the traitor known as Yudo Maeda, while the other's identity is completely unknown. Even after cross-referencing national data, they found nothing on him. Raven says he understands. As for that little rat Yudo who betrayed them, he must have finally discovered the death of his little brother. Don't call our friend Yudo a rat. He might be a simp, but he's no ordinary fool. Finally, he says both brothers are nothing but a nuisance. Recalling a past situation inside the Shadow Guild building, the two began to talk, Raven and Isashi, with our companion showing doubt about the next mission he'd have to carry out. But Raven simply told him it should be an easy task, and that it wasn't about the difficulty, but about the reason he had to kill him, since it was an order from a vengeful person. And nothing more. There was no real motive for it. Within the organization, our companion Isashi was given the codename Rat. But Raven, hearing the complaints, simply asks why that information would be imprecise, since he just needs to kill and collect the reward, even when our companion says they were trying to destroy Genesis. Raven presses him with that phrase, saying he truly has something interesting to say. Isashi affirms that the target of the assassination is one of his past comrades from the game, a mild-mannered healer who would never make enemies. And since healers are valuable targets, the only reason to kill them would be to damage Genesis. And if he left the organization with the influence he has, they simply couldn't let him go. Raven just asks what kind of reward they get for that, since even the Shadow Guild doesn't have time for such things. Isashi explains that currently, the main force for clearing trials in Japan is concentrated in Genesis. In other words, if they destroy Wings of Genesis, they could stop most trial completions easily. And they, as the Shadow Guild, could profit more easily from the failed trials. Raven congratulates him on his intelligence, but says he's wrong about one thing, because if they would do that, it would be much easier to destroy the entire country. With everything Genesis is doing, this would be possible for them. If another national-level trial appeared, they couldn't do anything against it and would simply be erased from history. And that is not Isashi's problem, since his life would end right there. While they were talking, Raven used his skills to create a rope through the shadows, wrapping it around our companion's foot. With the shadow connection, he simply imprisons him. Even though he was trapped, Isashi was only a hostage to control his brother's actions, because he couldn't control him with the power of shadows. But surprisingly, Raven responds that he's wrong, as out of all people, he would never be inferior to a rat. Even in that situation, Isashi continues to resist, saying he'd never be able to have things his way with his brother. But Raven only asks if he at least knows why he can't get in touch with his own brother, as he pulls out a massive spear with a glowing tip, stating it's exactly because he could hide all of that from him. And in a single direct strike to the chest, our companion Isashi is finished, pinned against the wall, as he merely warns that if he hadn't noticed something unnecessary, he would have stayed alive, being tortured as he always was. Returning directly to the present time, an old man says it's better to cut off one of their limbs and make it useless to deal with the trouble they cause, claiming he could have also played with Isashi like a toy. But Raven explains that given the situation they are in, they can't afford to leak any information. The old man confirms this is true. If things go well, Japan will soon disappear, and they can enjoy life at a resort, wondering if they go to Hawaii or the Maldives. That's Kuroki, a Shadow Guild member also considering a vacation in Dubai. A blonde guy, says the old man is overestimating himself, since he'd get bored in a day at a resort, implying he's better suited to playing with his horrible toys. The old man gets very irritated, asking what he meant by that, and if he thinks just because he's a kid he can say whatever he wants. This blonde kid's name is Jack, one of the three at Yudo's level, along with the old man and Raven. One of the men asks if a promotion to HQ wouldn't be great, as they take down a whole country and gain prestige. But old Kuroki, who hates the idea, warns that's exactly why he isn't successful. According to him, it's much more fun to kill people than to overthink things. Cutting them both off, Raven notes this is typical of the old man, but changes the subject, asking what happened to the men downstairs. The secretary reports that she even sent reinforcements, but they were all eliminated. Raven is clearly irritated by the situation, saying that since their enemy is that damn rat Yudo, of course the weaklings couldn't handle him. He decides to go finish them himself, and calls Kuroki and Jack to help. On the way, as they head to the fight, Kuroki notes they seem to be trying hard, asking Raven if he really thinks they need everyone to deal with those little rats. But in a very intimidating way, Raven tells him not to underestimate Yudo, as even a cornered rat can bite a cat if it's careless. Furthermore, remember, our protagonist, he warns the others that since they don't know the strength of that man, they must not underestimate him and must crush both with maximum force and everything they can use. After saying this, he begins a series of flashy movements with the spear and then slams it into the ground, declaring they must make sure they are pierced by his spear, returning to the middle of that endless battle that our protagonist and our brother Yudo were unfortunately facing. The protagonist notes that this situation really makes him wonder how many more of them are left. No matter how many he takes down, more just keep coming. After he says this, our employee brother mentions he's not sure, but thinks they've cleared out at least half. Even though it's exhausting, our MC knows this is pure profit. Suddenly, in the silence, Yudo notices someone starting to approach, and he becomes visibly nervous. This prompts the protagonist to ask what's wrong. That's when Yudo reveals that the man approaching is the very target they were looking for, Raven. Raven draws near, gripping his spear with a deathly serious expression, commenting that it's been a long time since he's seen the little rat Yudo, asking if he came here knowing full well what happened. Our brother replies that he already knows, and he's clearly there to avenge his sibling. Wasting no time, Yudo activates his acceleration skill, gripping his dual blades to lunge at Raven. But unfortunately, his skill is on cooldown, with over 3 hours left before he can use it again. Despite being unable to use the skill, he charges at full speed to attack the third-rate villain. As Raven watches the charge, the protagonist realizes Yudo has completely lost his composure. Regardless, he does nothing and just watches. This is Yudo's fight. However, in the middle of our brother's assault, Jack suddenly appears out of nowhere, using a wide slash to keep him away from Raven, nearly hitting him. Luckily, Yudo manages to dodge and asks who the hell he was. Little Jack simply mocks him, calling him an idiot for coming here just to die, asking Kuroki if it isn't hilarious. But the old man says laughing would be rude, instead scolding Yudo for throwing his life away for someone who's already dead anyway. When Yudo realizes these two are Jack and Kuroki, he understands they are finally being taken seriously. The protagonist simply asks who those two are, and if he should just toss them like coins. Ignoring the question, Yudo asks Raven with raw desperation why Isashi had to die. Raven simply says there was no grand motive, stating a rat bit its owner and was discarded. Yudo asks if he was killed just for defying him. Raven confirms, stating that test animals that are no longer useful are sent to the incinerator, adding that this simple rule must have been too hard for the animal brothers to grasp. This leaves our brother fuming, asking how they dare insult them. However, Raven's two allies are still there, and both lunge at our brother, telling him not to take his eyes off them or he'll die even faster. But in the middle of their joint attack, our protagonist simply interferes, using his soul barrier to strike both at once, sending them crashing to the ground like sacks of potatoes. Then he tells Yudo to handle the third-rate villain Raven while he takes care of the two on the floor. Our brother gives his thanks and then faces Raven, telling him to get ready as he advances, but Raven doesn't take him seriously at all, asking if he really thinks he can kill him without his acceleration skill. Raven uses a skill that creates an ice fortress right in front of Yudo's path. But despite the obstruction, Yudo tells him not to underestimate him, as he joins his two light blades together, forming a dual saber reminiscent of Star Wars. He leaps over the wall using his overheat explosion skill to melt a large chunk of that ice fortress. The problem is that the protagonist notices Raven's hidden scheme. As Raven smirks, our protagonist, even while fighting Jack and Kuroki at the same time, still has the reaction speed to trigger an explosion using coins, blasting Yudo backward. Naturally, Yudo is confused since he was just attacked by his own ally. But our protagonist tells him not to lower his guard, asking what would have happened if he hadn't stepped in. When our brother looks ahead, he sees a massive crystal, an ice pillar, erupting from the ground exactly where he was standing. He would have been skewered if not for the MC, who is still fighting the other two while talking. But before Yudo can even say thanks, our protagonist warns him that every rescue will cost him 1,000,000 yen out of pocket, so don't forget to pay up later. He adds that if he dies, he can't get revenge, but not to worry, because the protagonist has faith he'll win. Raven simply says he doesn't know the protagonist, but being with a little rat means he's the one who interfered in the mansion and art museum trials. Indu claims he has no idea what he's talking about, telling him to stop with the wild accusations, thinking that even if they know about Golden Farm, they don't know his true identity. Raven, still thinking he has the upper hand, asks why he's on Yudo's side despite the risk. Our protagonist smiles and replies that the reason is simple. It's all for the money. This leaves Raven genuinely stunned, opposing a shadow guild just for cash. But our protagonist interrupts, saying nothing in this world is more necessary than money. As he says this, he defeats Raven's two high-level subordinates using only one hand, stating that besides the bounty on Raven's head, he now has the chance to make Yudo work for him for free. He declares Raven killed Isashi for the Shadow Guild's profit, but now it's time for Raven to die for his profit. He says all this while emanating a massive blue aura, activating Soul Limit Break. In front of Yudo, a screen appears notifying him that the player king is attempting to use Limit Break on him, asking if he accepts or not, noting the skill carries a heavy penalty after use, and asking if he still wants to proceed. Without a second thought, he accepts. With his limit surpassed, he emits a colossal blue aura. With all his skill cooldowns completely reset, the system announces he has received the blessing of our protagonist's power for a limited time. Indu, with a sly grin, simply tells Yudo to go for it and hit Raven with everything. Our brother uses acceleration, but unlike before, the lightning isn't purple, it's blue. He lunges at Raven with everything he's got. Raven calls it a fool's errand, blocking the path with a massive volley of ice spikes, which he hurls at Yudo. After that, he asks if he had forgotten that no one knows his movements better than Raven himself, from techniques and skills to fighting habits. Even though Yudo's speed and dual blade techniques are impressive, he still has 3 weaknesses that put him at a disadvantage. First is his short range. Second is his lack of raw power. He says this while attacking our brother at close range with strikes from random directions. Even Yudo realizes that against a spear at the right distance, their speeds end up being matched. After that, Raven manages to land a direct blow that Yudo blocks with great difficulty, being pushed back quite a bit. The third disadvantage is his long cooldowns compared to Raven's. Since he used acceleration at the start, Raven thought the win was decided. Even Yudo knows this is true. He can't beat Raven with his own strength alone, but he still has one single chance to win. He doesn't give up, attacking relentlessly so Raven can't rest. But Raven asks what he's aiming for, as he can read every move like an open book. However, our brother also knows Raven's skills and knows there's only one thing to fear: damage reflection, taking incoming damage and redirecting it at the enemy. With the MC's blessing, the recoil of that skill would be exponentially more powerful and could kill him if Raven uses it. That's why he must break this skill before it activates. Thinking this, he manages to crack Raven's defense. Raven wonders where this kind of power is coming from. Just to irritate him, Yudo says who knows? Despite everything, he thinks the protagonist's blessing is truly powerful, allowing him to fight Raven toe-to-toe. But due to a slip-up, Raven tells him he was too naive as his reflection skill returns the damage with full force, shattering his defense and sending him flying backwards into the wall. After that hit, Yudo can't even move. Raven tells him he'll send him to the same place he sent his brother. But by incredible luck, Yudo looks to his right and dodges a sword thrown by the protagonist that whistles past, grazing his cheek and embedding itself in the wall. This leaves the third-rate villain extremely pissed, screaming at the protagonist to stay out of it, saying he's next anyway. But the attack wasn't meant to hit. The protagonist just tells Yudo to use that sword. Realizing he fell into a trap, Raven tries to move, but it's too late. He is skewered by the sword wielded by our brother. Yudo says that while Raven learned to read his moves, he didn't expect Yudo to have also learned the protagonist's dagger techniques. After pulling the sword from Raven's body, the villain falls to the floor, stiff as a board, just like a sack of potatoes. Yudo is overwhelmed with emotion, realizing he has finally avenged his little brother as he remembers the moments they once shared. While he recalls those events, the backlash of our protagonist's skill hits him as the soul limit break reaches its end. Yudo wanted to finish Raven off with his own moves, but to console him, the protagonist simply catches him as he falls and lets him know it wasn't just a skill, but Yudo's own effort. However, nearly fainting, he asks what happened to the old man and the kid. Our protagonist just tells him he took care of them long ago and points to the two unconscious bodies behind them. As we flash back to see what happened while our protagonists were watching Yudo fight Raven, the two tried to catch him off guard, and the protagonist was actually impressed to see they were still alive after what he had done. Jack activates his aura of death, and the protagonist realizes it's basically a field where Jack's skills progressively improve. Within this field, Jack tries again to use the wide slash he had launched at Yudo before all this chaos began. After our protagonist leaps to dodge, the old man tries to use a charged thrust with his sword from behind, while our protagonist is still in midair, challenging our protagonist to dodge in the air while Jack attacks from the front and the old man from behind. That is exactly what he does. He doesn't just dodge. He finishes with Jack in the air and almost teleports behind the old man. After slicing his sword in half, standing behind the old man, the protagonist simply calls him stupid for throwing away his weapon. And just like Jack, Kuroki is also defeated. Returning to the present, Yudo laughs at the situation, seeing how our protagonist took them both out in an instant. The protagonist notes this was predictable, as the skill gap made it naturally easy. Yudo, battered and bruised, just apologizes to our protagonist since he won't be able to move for a while after a fight like that and needs to rest. Naturally, the protagonist tells him to stop lying around in the corner because he's in the way of his money. But then another voice rings out, asking them both if it isn't a bit too early to rest. A man, holding a pike, tells them he really didn't expect the little rat Yudo to defeat someone like Raven, but just looking at him, he's as good as dead, so he won't have to worry about him anymore. Our protagonist just responds that, in fact, the Shadow Guild reinforcements arrived sooner than the Genesis reinforcements he requested. The protagonist is pleased to see around 20 people, remembering they're worth about $1 million each, stating that this dungeon has become a very lucrative hunting ground for him as he prepares to strike. The next scene is incredibly anticlimactic. Our protagonist simply pokes the body of the man already on the ground, saying he was much weaker than he looked. Regardless, he's getting the reward anyway, so it doesn't matter. Just then, several cars begin to arrive bearing the Wings of Genesis symbol, and the protagonist sarcastically celebrates their arrival, mocking the delay, as he removes his mask, which looks more like a pair of goggles, and reverts to his original appearance. The guild leader, Sakino, looks at the protagonist and congratulates him on the great job he did, saying they both managed to completely clear the Shadow Guild base alone. She can't believe he pulled it off, but our protagonist just says it was easy, very easy for him. Sakino asks where our friend Yudo is, and the protagonist points to the lazy guy passed out on the ground, snoring like a baby. The poor guy is still celebrating just being alive. She notes it must have been a tough fight for him to be in that state. Regardless, she announces that Genesis will assist with the total blockade of the base. Meanwhile, in the back, Yuto was healed by a healer who arrived to help and ended up giving his thanks alongside the protagonist. One of the men with the captain complains that a base blockade is a problematic approach, questioning if it wouldn't be easier to just drag the criminals out as fast as possible. A bald man agrees, saying Genesis's strength far exceeds the Shadow Guild's, and they could capture them all in one sweep. But she rejects the idea, stating the commander is our protagonist, known by his player name, King. Tsukino asserts they must obey his rules, and questioning is forbidden. Eventually, someone interrupts the argument, scolding the two men, warning them that the captain had already stated this earlier, asking if they weren't listening. That person is Yuri Ashino, a member. The bald man gets irritated, telling her not to meddle, but she challenges him, asking if he thinks he can talk to her like that just because she's a woman, calling him baldy. Our protagonist cuts the argument short, saying the enemy's strength lies in their numbers, and to prevent any variables, they must contain the combat in a closed area, just like they did this time. He warns that if anyone disagrees, they can do as they please, but he won't cooperate or take responsibility if they die. Finally, the protagonist asks if anyone still disagrees with his plan, and if so, to raise their hand. Only the bald man and the guy in the cap raise their hands. No one else dares. Naturally, they pretend nothing happened. They tried to argue with the captain again, but she brushed them off and didn't give the man in the cap the floor. But the protagonist doesn't let that slide without consequence, telling Yuto to keep an eye on those two, whispering that they seem very suspicious. As night fell, the leader ordered all prisoners captured there to be taken back to the guild. Meanwhile, in the background, a massive barbecue was being prepared. Best of friends, everyone gathered to enjoy the moment. Even though our protagonist did all the work, everyone celebrated. They were basically camping, waiting for Shadow Guild members to arrive or a delivery to show up. It wasn't very practical, having a barbecue under the moonlight right in front of the enemy base, essentially screaming we're here. Regardless, Tsukino was talking to Yuri, saying that despite being there for 3 hours, no one had appeared. Yuri complains that they are very persistent. But the most impressive thing is our protagonist in a small pink apron, saying info about the Genesis reinforcements probably leaked, but they can just wait patiently. Because when the enemy gets desperate and tries to break the barrier, they'll be there to stop them. They'll slowly starve since the entrance is blocked. Yuto interrupts, saying at least they have delicious meat while the Shadow Guild members suffer inside from the smell. The protagonist just replies that Genesis prepared it all anyway. Tsukino and Yuri explain that camping missions are exhausting, so the more comfortable they are, the better they can rest and eat, allowing them to fight at full strength. But mid-sentence, she stops herself, saying it seems their short break is over, as two suspicious men are approaching. The protagonist asks if they should send 2 people. The bald man says since there are only a few, it looks more like a scout team than an attack force. But the protagonist disagrees, saying in player combat, quality always beats quantity. A pair of highly skilled opponents is much more troublesome than 100 weaklings. Then he asks Yuto if he recognizes them. Surprisingly, Yuto confirms, saying they are definitely high-ranking members of the Shadow Guild and likely stronger than the Late Raven. He recalls 3 with the aliases Beta, Gamma, and Alpha. Beyond that, he knows nothing. Eventually, Tsukino shows the scout team's recordings, featuring 2 people, one with white hair and one with purple hair. She asks if he recognizes them. They're new faces to him, though they might be Beta and Gamma. The protagonist says he understands, and starts thinking that the other advanced rank member must be inside the castle, likely planning a flank. Tsukino asks if the protagonist prefers a strategy where she takes one, while she and the rest handle the other, with others guarding against interference. She says this seems well-balanced, but the protagonist says she can do as she likes. Yuto warns them to be extremely careful. Though he only met Alpha once, he's never seen anyone as terrifying before or since. Ignoring that, the protagonist asks the guild leader if the stronger enemies have better rewards. She says no, saying all rewards are the same regardless of strength. The protagonist finds that boring and prefers killing the weaklings, since it's more profitable. He tells Yuto to take charge of the other team. Late into the night, the captain asks if everyone is ready. As they confirm, a massive energy begins to shake the area. They start wondering what the hell is going on. Before the captain can order everyone to the ground, a small sphere of red energy appears before them, piercing straight through the wall and the entrance. A massive beam tears across the battlefield, knocking most of them down and wounding some. Everyone questions where such incredible destructive power came from, asking if anyone is hurt. Some are indeed badly injured, so healers must help. From the middle of that bridge, two people, who appeared in the recordings, begin to approach. The purple-haired one says he hoped to kill everyone in that attack, but since it failed, the white-haired one asks for another energy shot. The captain notes those guys won't go down easily. Yudo wants to handle the dual wielder, but Tsukino says that won't be possible while he's charging energy in the sword. Channeling fire in her blade, she launches a fire cyclone at the two, engulfing them in the explosion of flames, saying she'll handle both of them alone. Well done, her. As the sky turns blood red from the ash, someone at the top of the castle starts complaining about the noise at such an hour, calling it incredibly rude, biting a piece of straw with red eyes, saying they shouldn't mess with Tsukimi. While the captain stood before that massive wall of flame she created, making everyone admire the incredible size of the fire. She notes that originally, fire cyclone wasn't a skill for fighting people, but from the center of the flames. Surprisingly, the white-haired man with the long cleaver-like sword lunges at her, completely unharmed. By pure luck, she manages to block his attack. He asks if she's really the guild leader, saying she's not bad for a woman, but his attack forced an opening in her defense. The purple-haired dual-wielder was closing in to strike with great force. But luckily, Yori stepped in, using her dagger to block the attacks. The purple-haired man even complimented her, saying there were actually some strong people in this place. For some reason, Tsukino actually thanks him for the praise while she continues to block the white-haired man's strikes as he relentlessly pressures her defense. He asks her if that girl would have already been dead if he weren't there, warning that Transcendentals are exactly like that. They seem incredibly strong against monsters, but have zero real combat experience. She retorts, telling him not to underestimate Transcendentals, claiming her entire team has far more experience than the two of them combined. However, he disagrees, stating he's not talking about monsters, but the experience of killing people. He leaps backward into midair, activating a skill to spit out a glowing needle that strikes directly into her shoulder. This catches her off guard and sends her to her knees instantly, her vision becoming completely distorted. A system screen pops up, informing her that she's been afflicted with the deadly poison status. Logically, all the members of her guild start panicking and try to heal her, but unfortunately, it doesn't work. And she just continues to sink further into pain. The white-haired man, who looks like a total psychopath because he actually is, says it's all useless since none of the healers present can cure his poison. Even Tsukino confirms his words, but she still manages to stand up, channeling all her energy to create a massive flame on her sword. She declares she just has to end this fight before the poison spreads completely, and that's all she needs to do to stop being affected, dodging the flames while commenting that it's actually terrifying how powerful she is. But he mocks her, saying those who fight monsters really love flashy techniques, but in the end, they're useless against him. He bruises the captain's ego, reminding her that she herself said those skills are useless if they can't hit players who hunt other players. But even as he tries to attack again, she responds with another fire cyclone. Only this time, it's much larger than before. However, he stands in the middle of the flames like it's nothing, and it really isn't. He informs her he has a skill that can completely lubricate the flame she's throwing, so it's just a waste of her energy. Unfortunately for him, he doesn't notice that behind him, a member of her guild, wielding a massive hammer imbued with lightning, charges in and delivers a heavy blow, using a hammer crush skill that catches him by surprise, slamming him into the ground with full force. The white-haired man's arm actually hurts a bit, and he grumbles, calling the hammer user a muscular idiot. But he doesn't realize 3 other people are closing in from behind to attack. One with a spear using deep penetration, another with a bow firing a fatal shot, and the third using true circle to deliver a katana slash. The 3 launch a surprise pincer attack from behind, giving him no chance to dodge. Finally, Tsukino explains that area of effect, AoE, skills lose power because they disperse, making them only effective against weaklings. However, a large-scale fire attack ruins the enemy's vision, and in a situation where they have the numbers, the enemy loses their advantage. She concludes that he really doesn't know much, as she collapses to the ground, unconscious. But the system reports that because the player Xiao Feilong has died, the deadly poison status has been removed from her. In the end, that big guy, who was using the hammer earlier, helps her up, saying the idea to use smoke to disorient the enemy was brilliant and worked perfectly. She confirms they practiced it a lot and it paid off. She adds that the strength of the Genesis Guild doesn't lie in individual power, but in the strength of the organization itself, which is why they train so hard. They watch the massive mountain of smoke she created with her skill. On the other side of that fog and flame, we see our friend Yudo fighting the purple-haired dual-wielder directly. The enemy uses a thermal slash that hits Yudo squarely on the shoulder. This man thought he had heard all about how the little rat had betrayed them, and that his power was inferior to his own. But the problem was that girl, Yuri Ashino. He begins to analyze her stats. Her weapon is a dagger, and her assigned class is Elite Rogue. She's approximately 28 years old, single, and lives in Musashino City. She's a member of a theater troupe and has normal physical traits. Despite being Captain Sakino's right hand, she has no notable battle achievements. He wonders if the spy's report was wrong, since he can't land a single hit. It's because of the control she has over him that he's always pulled into the range of Yudo's attacks. He wonders why they didn't tell him her combat skills were this high. While thinking, he continues to defend, but eventually, one of her strikes gashes his chest, and our friend approaches from behind with dual swords, just as they are about to finish him. The purple-haired man uses Blade Storm, performing several consecutive slashes to push them back and gain distance. He realizes he needs to retreat immediately, but in the middle of his move, he notices a massive net of golden threads has begun to envelop him. He realizes this is Indu's skill, but seeing who's using it, he realizes it's actually Yuri. As the man asks who the hell she is, she uses a domain expansion, making a hand seal to activate the skill. Then she ignites all the golden threads using the full skill, Soul Thread, Soul Incineration Matrix. With this, she burns the man completely until he's wiped off the map. After the battle ends, we see the protagonist approaching in a way that's strangely disconnected from his usual personality, asking Yuri if Ray-san had already finished. Strangely, Yuri confirms it went well, calling the protagonist Body Ray Yuri. Naturally, the guy in the cap is extremely confused about what's happening, along with the muscular hammer user. Simply after they finish speaking, our protagonist Body starts using the appearance change, skill, and finally reveals that the two had actually swapped appearances with Yuri. She says she was really nervous about the whole thing and complained that it was very hard to act like our protagonist. Here's the trick. Remember the protagonist was wearing a pink apron and didn't appear in the battles? And the purple-haired guy mentioned she took a theater course? It's all connected. Absolute cinema. More architected than a Marvel movie. Anyway, the bald guy is completely lost, asking if she had really transformed into Indu and what was going on. She explains that using the appearance change skill, she had swapped places with our friend. Since Wings of Genesis is specialized in clearing dungeons in record time, the best thing to do was leave the human-on-human combat to our protagonist, who is a pro at it. Our friend Indu says the whole thing was actually Tsukino Airi's idea, and in the end, it worked out better than expected. At the same time, he thinks he's not exactly a human combat specialist like she said, but it doesn't matter. Because now, the only person left was Alpha. He calls him out to show himself, asking how long he planned to just sit up there and watch. From above, that man who was waiting earlier stops complaining about the noise and wonders who our protagonist really is, telling him not to get cocky. He then says it doesn't matter how many weaklings gather. In the end, he'll turn this whole place into a mass grave for them. This leaves our protagonist extremely pensive as he prepares to receive an attack. And that's exactly what the man does, dismantling the entire temporary camp. As expected, our protagonist sees the attack coming and dodges. Yudo helps Yuri so she doesn't take a hit to the head. She blushes as he holds her, and we all know the blush rule. Our protagonist orders Yudo and Tsukino to evacuate everyone. Meanwhile, he realizes the man's attack was coming straight for his face. Luckily, he manages to dodge, and that blade, apparently controlled by mana, continues to chase our protagonist, who keeps evading. After that, we see Alpha with several swords floating around him, exactly like Gilgamesh from Fate, preparing to launch them all at our protagonist at once. saying he wants to see how our protagonist manages to escape this. It was an absolute avalanche of attacks from all sides, but thanks to his experience, our protagonist manages to dodge. Finally, he uses his sword to slice through the air, revealing that all those swords actually had phantom arms controlling them. Once he cut those arms, the sword stopped moving instantly and fell to the ground. Alpha congratulates our protagonist for managing to block his skill on the first try. He says it's not a huge surprise considering our protagonist passed the Earth exam, but it's truly impressive that he's floating. Tsukino and Yuri are shocked by the ghost arms and him floating. Our protagonist reflects on the berserker spirit and soul of invisible hands, summarizing those skills as cloned arms that attack the enemy relentlessly. Realizing the nature of these skills, our protagonist shouts to Tsukino, explaining that his skill consumes a lot of stamina. If they cover the enemy's healer, he won't be able to show himself or heal. They must prevent him from getting close, so he can't recover. As soon as he finishes, she tells her team to cover the castle and not let anyone escape, using long-range attacks. Meanwhile, our protagonist continues in direct combat against Alpha, who gives him no openings, saying that clearly. This will be a war of attrition, claiming this kind of strategy is useless. Our protagonist thinks he really isn't letting him get any advantage at range, and that Berserker Spirit is considered one of the strongest classes at low levels. The number of attacks is massive and terrifying. While our protagonist runs, he still takes a hit to the cheek. Alpha mocks him, asking how long he plans to keep running. The captain and vice captain of Genesis realize our protagonist is being completely cornered, noting Alpha's speed and power skills are extremely overpowered. But our companion, Employee 3, aka Yudo, says it's not like that and they should look closer. He says that claiming our protagonist is cornered or discouraged isn't right. He's only blocking the attacks that would cause fatal damage. While he explains this, he points out that saying our protagonist is cornered or losing heart is totally wrong, as he's only blocking the strikes that would deal fatal damage. And while he's explaining this, our protagonist keeps fighting and blocking those attacks, thinking that since Alpha's class consumes a massive amount of stamina, if he keeps this up, it's only a matter of time before the guy gasps for air. If Alpha stops his barrage, he won't be able to block our MC's counter, so he wonders what Alpha's next move will be. But after being dragged out for so long, our second-rate villain finally loses his cool, unleashing an extremely powerful slash that almost. It's our protagonist, who mutters close one. Alpha then calls him incredibly annoying while raising his sword and conjuring a massive swarm of blades in the air, declaring they'll settle this right here, right now. He calls out our protagonist's name, and then activates the skill Soul Overload. Our protagonist observes the overwhelming number of swords. Staring back at them, he truly thinks this is going to be a pain as they all come raining down on him, creating a massive explosion on the ground while he leaps away, stepping off the taxi. Amidst the shock of everyone watching, our protagonist uses the Soul Servant skill, summoning a massive bluish serpent that looks like a dragon. He faces Alpha with a bloodthirsty gaze, saying he's prepared a massive feast for it. Naturally, Alpha is enraged, questioning how a mere snake could stand against him. He unleashes a torrent of skills and swords at our protagonist and manages to land hits consistently. Thanks to the healers, Alpha receives all kinds of support like Elemental Cure, Advanced Heal, and even Damage Recovery. The three healers shout simultaneously that they can't keep up with the sheer amount of damage being dealt to our protagonist. Alpha watches the scene and tells our protagonist to behold the true power of a berserker, saying he shouldn't even dream of competing with a main class, calling him a rookie. And I think he's about to get what's coming to him, because calling our MC a rookie is a direct hit to his ego. But anyway, Tsukino orders the healers to do everything they can, but they impressively realize that our protagonist's HP isn't dropping at all. Just as they notice this, Alpha realizes it too, wondering what on earth is going on. That massive blue serpent begins to shake, splitting apart and transforming into several smaller serpents. Their numbers increase at an incredible rate, with our protagonist standing atop the head of just one. As he says he already told them he'd give them a massive feast, asking if Alpha really thought it wouldn't be normal for their numbers to multiply like this. All those swords begin to be devoured by the serpents, with our protagonist noting that it seems the food has run out, but tells him not to worry, as he points at Alpha, saying there's still some very fresh meat left right in front of them. Naturally, After hearing himself being called food, Alpha is visibly upset, glaring at our MC and wondering if he was really just called food by someone like him, telling him he'll regret saying that in the afterlife. While he's talking, suddenly, the protagonist begins to slice through the serpents, killing almost all of them instantly using a skill called Soul Territory. The protagonist was a bit surprised by the incredible volume of swords being launched simultaneously. Realizing the number of swords, arms, and even power had increased in exchange for losing some range. However, this type of fighting consumes a lot of HP, so they wouldn't last long against the full serpent. His main target, logically, had to be Alpha, and just as he was thinking this, he almost takes a spear strike to the back. Fortunately, the protagonist is saved at the last second by Yudo, who uses his acceleration to arrive before the spear could touch him. Yudo faces the bald man and the guy in the cap, saying they've finally revealed their true colors. He charges at them, saying he'll punish them himself, before the poor guys could even do anything. They took 2 hits to the back of the neck and fell unconscious to the ground. Turning our attention back to what really matters, we see that the protagonist, who had been paying attention to Yudo, forgot to focus on his own battle with Alpha. Alpha attacked the protagonist from behind like a coward, but he managed to dodge and suddenly spun around and drove his sword into Alpha's chest, slamming him to the ground that very instant. Alpha logically asked how he managed to block an attack perfectly designed as an undodgeable surprise. But the protagonist replied that there's no such thing as a surprise attack, since he knew those two were spies from the start. This was proven when he simply told Yudo to keep an eye on those two right from the beginning. Alpha spat some blood while asking the protagonist if he really thought he could lead a normal life after making enemies like them, warning him not to count on it. Surprisingly, Alpha dissolved into smoke and glitter. And with that, as the protagonist stood atop the great serpent with the moon behind him, he said that now most of the Shadow Guild, his force had been completely wiped out, and all that was left was to collect the rewards. Moving directly to the next day, we see some people were captured, and a head count was basically done, like 1,000,000 yen per person. The total was 452. The protagonist received approximately 452 million yen, which was being moved by a gold transport team. After the shipment was completed, the protagonist told Tsukino that things seemed to be over. He told her she could do whatever she wanted with what was left of the castle, and she asked if there was even anything left, thinking he had finished everything. The protagonist held up a bag of suspicious white powder, saying that since she mentioned it, he found it there. She simply told him she didn't need anything like that. Back at the Gold Farm Guild, the protagonist meets with Rumi, who tells him that all the reward transfers have been completed. The protagonist thanks her, saying she did a good job. Furthermore, she informs him that as recognition for his contribution to the guild, a government assistant would be assigned to him. The protagonist logically wonders what that is, saying he wouldn't accept any kind of government surveillance. Knowing what he'd say, she asked what they should do with the exorbitant amount of gold obtained through murder and theft. Yudo, while holding a large amount of gold, asked if maybe a gold shop could buy it all. Rumi confirmed that due to the massive quantity, it seemed impossible. The protagonist simply said it was still property of a criminal organization anyway. Just then, someone enters the room asking for permission and if the protagonist was there. When he asks who she is, she asks if he really doesn't remember her. She reminds him that they met during the certificate exam and the player ranking association. But he denied remembering anything that didn't make him money. A bit nervous at the comment, she introduced herself, asking him to remember her as Sakuma Misa, not Sukuna, Ryaman the King of Curses. Wrong script, it's Sakuma. When she mentioned her name, Rumi remembered talking to her, that she was registered in the rank exam. The protagonist simply asked if she was going to make money for him again or not. Then he commented that she looked a bit different. She confirmed the Japanese government sent her as an assistant for him. In other words, a free assistant who works hard and saves on labor costs. The protagonist simply said he didn't need her, pointing to the many muscular men behind him, saying he already had plenty of brute force, and they all worked for free. Desperate, she told him she'd do anything he needed, asking if she couldn't stay. Logically, all the men there started thinking the wrong things since a girl was suddenly offering to work for the protagonist for nothing in return. But the dense guy didn't have time for that, since she started saying she knew how to do everything from cleaning an office to getting cars, even laundering assets that couldn't be made public or even sourcing illegal weapons and explosives in any country. In short, she could help with anything absolutely illegal. The protagonist just looked at this government operation, thinking it was actually interesting. She continued, saying, for example, she could exchange all the gold bars for him without revealing their origin or legality. Asking what he thought of that, she said she'd basically smuggle them to sell abroad and then transfer the money to him secretly. She added that if they did it with a special small commission for the Player Association, nothing would look suspicious. Finally, she asked if the gold bars had been found in Tachijai Mountain with a malicious look, asking if the protagonist wanted to try. But he simply cut her off, saying he didn't trust her enough. But suddenly, she speaks to him in a language the protagonist understands, asking what he thought about receiving 5 billion yen all at once. She said the actual value of the gold bars should be higher than that, and she'd transfer it to him later. Logically, he asked if she could really do something like that, and she confirmed she could move that value completely independently, saying she'd do it in less than 10 minutes. The protagonist took it very seriously, setting a 10-minute timer and saying he wanted to see her in action. He told her to go for it. Even the subordinates were shocked that he was taking it seriously, and apparently she was too, as she understood and started heading somewhere. 10 minutes later, Rumi was scared and shaking as she saw on the tablet screen that 5 billion yen had been transferred to the protagonist's account, and the sender's name was the Player Association. She simply walked back in, asking if he finally understood, saying she thought she could be very useful for the protagonist and the Gold Farm Guild. Don't forget to leave a like so I can continue bringing the next part of this work. What did you think of this story? Personally, I loved it. A hug until the next work, guys.